On an August evening in 2010, 36-year-old Rusty Snyderman could barely contain his excitement as he talked to a small group of people in his kitchen in Dunwoody, Georgia, an upscale suburb of Atlanta. Rusty and his wife Andrea had some friends over, and people were spread out across the large suburban home, laughing, eating, and drinking. But in the kitchen, Rusty was talking to Hemi Newman, who was his wife's boss, along with a couple other friends, about a new business that Rusty was launching. Rusty was lanky with short brown hair, and he could barely see without his glasses on. And when he talked about something that he was passionate about, he used his whole body. And Rusty was very passionate about this new business idea, so he was very animated as he spoke. He told his captive audience that his idea was to start a company that provided celebrity voicemail services. So basically, somebody could pay a famous actor or singer or athlete to create the outgoing voicemail message on the person who was paying's phone, or a friend's phone as a gift or something like that. To make this more clear, if I were to pay for this, I would have a voicemail that would say, "Hey, you've reached the voicemail of John Allen, leave a message after the beep," but instead of it being my voice, it would be some celebrity saying as much. Now, remember, this was several years before celebrity video services like Cameo would come out, so the people listening to this idea had never heard of anything like this before, and they thought it was absolutely brilliant. Hemi, who was an executive at General Electric, which is a big appliance company, liked the idea, but did raise some questions about overhead costs and stuff like that. And the other people that were listening, Rusty's friends, they wanted to know how would he get these famous people on board with the concept. And Rusty, who people said was a born entrepreneur, had an answer for all their questions. And he really believed that if he did this right, the company would grow and it would even become something potentially that was so big and successful that he could pass it down to his kids. And so as Rusty was talking about his big plan, his wife Andrea stepped into the kitchen and overheard what they were talking about, and she quickly kind of chimed in that, maybe if this business is as successful as Rusty thinks, they wouldn't even need to worry about their kids' future job prospects. Their 5-year-old daughter and 2-year-old son would be just set because of this great business. And even though she was sort of joking about this, being so committed to this totally succeeding, there was some truth to that. She really believed this was going to be a success, same as Rusty. But Andrea's excitement was more about her husband having something to focus on rather than the actual company he was going to build. Andrea had known Rusty had a great mind for business since they started dating back in college at the University of Indiana. And not long after graduating, Andrea had moved with Rusty while he earned a master's degree from Harvard Business School. They had gotten married soon after that, moved to Georgia when Rusty got a job offer, and they started their family. And initially, things went great for Rusty on the work front. A few years earlier, in 2007, he'd gotten a job as the chief financial officer for a large chain of daycares, and he was making a ton of money. But over the last year, Rusty had begun clashing with the men who owned the company, and so they ultimately fired him. And that had changed everything back at their home. Andrea, who had always been kind of a math whiz, went ahead and got a job, and a really good one, a well-paying job at GE to support the family, and Rusty, who was now out of work, became a stay-at-home dad. Andrea knew Rusty did not resent her at all, even though her job often required her to travel a lot and leave him alone with the kids, but she also knew Rusty loved working. And so now that he had this new idea for this celebrity voicemail company, she just felt like he seemed so much happier and in such a better place, way better than he had been over the past couple of months. In the kitchen, Andrea grabbed a soda out of the fridge and asked her boss and Rusty's friends if they needed anything. They said they were fine, so Andrea said okay. She turned around and headed into the other room to speak to some of the other guests. Later that night, after all the guests had gone, Rusty and Andrea cleaned up the house, and as they did, they talked about what a great time they'd had. They also got excited discussing an upcoming cruise they were going on in a few months, just the two of them. Their kids would be with their grandparents, and so Rusty and Andrea would finally have time to reconnect, just the two of them. Even though things had been kind of tough the last few months, they both felt good about where their lives were heading. And to their surprise, they actually felt sort of lucky to live in this town of Dunwoody, Georgia. Rusty and Andrea had grown up in the Midwest of the United States, and they had really worried they wouldn't fit in when they moved here to the South. But over the years, Dunwoody had proven to be the perfect place for them. Their house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac in this beautiful secluded neighborhood that backed right up to sprawling woods filled with oak and pine trees. And they were close enough to Atlanta to also enjoy all the city had to offer as well. But most importantly, to Rusty and Andrea, Dunwoody had a tight, supportive Jewish community, which was not the case for a lot of suburbs in the area. Rusty and Andrea credited the Jewish community for helping them adjust to life in the South, and for weathering challenges like when Rusty had lost his job. So Dunwoody felt like home, a great town to raise their kids in, and the right place for Rusty to launch this next phase of his career. But a little later that night, as Rusty worked on his business proposal at the kitchen table, something so strange, almost completely unbelievable, was happening in Dunwoody. It was something that nobody who lived in the small suburb would have ever imagined. A few minutes from Rusty and Andrea Snyderman's house, a driver sat in their parked car on the side of a neighborhood street. The car felt ice cold, but sweat dripped down the driver's face. They could feel their chest getting tight, and they heard this loud rumbling sound coming from their passenger seat. The driver shook their head. "Please don't let this happen to me again." But there was nothing the driver could do. The car rattled, a light flashed outside, and then the demon appeared in the passenger seat. The driver tried to hide their eyes, but they couldn't look away, like the demon was forcing the driver to stare at it. The demon's head nearly touched the roof of the car, and its legs were massive. It wore a dark cloak and hood, and when the driver looked at it, they felt like all hope inside of them was just draining away. The demon turned its head away from the driver and began to talk. Its voice was deep and powerful. The driver thought the demon actually sounded like the 1970s soul and R&B singer Barry White, who was famous for songs like "Can't Get Enough of Your Love, Babe." The driver trembled, but the demon said there was no need to be afraid. The driver had been chosen to carry out a mission. The driver begged the demon to please leave them alone, but the demon said the mission was too important to ignore. Suddenly, the whole car shook and light flooded in from all sides. The driver shielded their eyes again, but they also felt a perfect sense of calm coming over them. They looked back at the passenger seat, and now the demon was gone. In its place sat an angel wrapped in light. The angel spoke, and the driver thought immediately that it sounded just like Olivia Newton-John, the actress and singer who had starred in movie musicals like Grease and Xanadu. When the angel spoke, they said the driver really was the only one who could carry out this very important mission the demon had already mentioned. So the driver asked, "What's the mission?" The angel smiled and said members of the Snyderman family were in grave danger, and the driver had to protect them. On the morning of November 10th, so about 3 months after the angel and demon appeared in that driver's car, Andrea rushed into her kitchen holding her 5-year-old daughter's hand. Rusty was in the kitchen helping their son finish his breakfast. Andrea and her daughter both gave Rusty a kiss and told him they'd see him later, and then they headed out to the garage. Whenever Andrea was not traveling, she always made a point to drive her daughter to kindergarten on her way to work. It was just another way for her to bond with her child. After they were gone, Rusty's son finished eating, and Rusty cleaned up the kitchen and then got his son dressed for preschool. At about 8:30 a.m., Rusty carried his son out to the silver Infiniti car parked in the garage, opened up the garage door, and then buckled the boy into his car seat in the back. But before Rusty closed the car door, he hesitated. A strange smell was coming from outside. Rusty couldn't tell if it was gasoline or something else, so he walked out of the garage and scanned the yard, and he saw something move out of the corner of his eye. Rusty turned to the side of the house, and he saw someone laying in the grass. He didn't know if this person was sleeping or hurt or what was going on, so he just shouted, "Hey, are you okay?" The person jumped up and just stared at Rusty. It was a man with a thick black mustache, and he wore a wool hat and earmuffs. Rusty immediately felt like something is wrong with this person, so he turned, ran back into his garage, hopped in the car, locked the doors, and then he pulled out into the street with his little son in back. And then, as Rusty began to drive away, he looked and saw this man with the earmuffs running down a long path that led to the woods behind the cul-de-sac. Rusty had no idea what any of this meant, so he just grabbed his phone and called 911. When the emergency operator picked up, Rusty told them what he had just seen and gave as good of a description as he could of the man with the earmuffs. Rusty also said he thought he smelled something like gasoline outside of his house right before he saw this guy. The operator told Rusty they would send a police unit over right away to look around, and Rusty said, okay, great, but he still had to drive his son to school, but right after that, he would come back home and be ready to talk to police. A few minutes later, Rusty arrived at the preschool and walked his son inside, and then afterward, he headed right back home. And when he got there, police officers, firefighters, and a workman from the gas company were all arriving as well. Rusty told his story to the police again, and they said other officers were already out looking for this man he described. Then, the gas company employee said Rusty's house did have a gas leak, but nothing had been tampered with. Whoever had been at the house in the front yard didn't appear to have caused the leak. It was just an odd coincidence. And the guy said he had fixed the leak already, and the gas company employees said, the leak was a very easy fix. Later that day, after all the emergency personnel and the gas company employee were all gone, Rusty still didn't have any real answers about who the heck that guy was. Officers said that, the guy with the earmuffs could have been a homeless person sleeping near his house, but that made no sense to Rusty. Things like that just didn't happen in this neighborhood. But police had said that until they found this guy with the earmuffs and the mustache, there really wasn't much they could do. So that night, when Andrea came home and Rusty filled her in about this guy, they talked about it and just said, all we can do is be super vigilant whenever they left the house. And they said they would do their best not to worry too much. They didn't want the kids to get a sense that their parents were scared of something. But Rusty admitted he was glad that he and Andrea were leaving town for their cruise soon, and that the kids would not be at the house either. They'd be with their grandparents. And Rusty hoped that, by the time they all came back home after the cruise, things would be back to normal in the neighborhood. Meaning, the guy with the earmuffs and the mustache has been found, and hopefully will not be back anytime soon. 8 days later, at 9 a.m. on November 18th, Rusty pulled up to his son's preschool. Rusty and Andrea had gotten back from their cruise a couple of days earlier, and Rusty felt rejuvenated. And nothing strange had happened at the house since they'd returned, so he hoped that the man lying in the grass was just some weird one-time occurrence. Rusty unbuckled his son from the car seat and led him into the preschool. And then Rusty chatted with a few other parents who were also doing drop-offs, and then a few minutes later, Rusty was headed back towards his car. However, when Rusty reached his car and opened up the driver's side door, he suddenly heard footsteps, and he glanced over his shoulder, and he saw a man with brown hair and a beard walking quickly towards him. Seconds later, screams rang out in the preschool parking lot as a silver minivan peeled out and sped away. One of the other parents ran over to Rusty's car where the scream had come from. The driver's side door was still open, and Rusty lay on the ground in a pool of blood. The woman could see Rusty was still breathing, so she screamed for help and then called 911. In the shopping center right next to the preschool, a woman happened to see what was going on, and so she immediately ran into a doctor's office that happened to be nearby. And right away, a doctor and a nurse darted out of that office, and they ran over to Rusty. The doctor quickly checked Rusty's pulse and then began administering CPR. And soon, the doctor heard an ambulance siren wailing down the street. By this time, people from inside the preschool who heard all this commotion had began running outside into the parking lot. But luckily, all of the children were outside behind the school and had no idea what was happening, including Rusty's son. The ambulance arrived and paramedics took over for the doctor, trying to keep Rusty alive. They got Rusty onto a gurney, into the ambulance, and then they sped towards the hospital. A few minutes later, Detective Andrew Thompson of the Dunwoody Police Department arrived at the preschool. He saw a few of his fellow officers trying their best to keep a growing crowd away from Rusty's car. Detective Thompson had been a cop in Atlanta for 8 years before moving here to Dunwoody, but he'd only been a detective for about 2 years. And he'd also never been the lead investigator on a potential homicide, and he knew that's what he had on his hands right now. Thompson got out of his car, he briefly spoke with the officers on site, and then began taking witness statements. The few people who had seen what happened all said the same thing. A man with brown hair and a beard stepped out of a silver minivan, walked right up to Rusty Snyderman, and shot him multiple times. Then the man with the beard got back in the minivan and drove off. Other than the man having a beard, the witnesses didn't notice anything that stood out about the shooter's appearance. But one witness said the shooter seemed remarkably calm considering what he did. He walked up calm as can be, shot Rusty, and then turned and calmly walked back to the van before leaving. Detective Thompson thanked all the witnesses for their help and then kind of gently told them to please step back, and then he and the other officers began searching the area right around Rusty's car. A trail of blood now stretched out almost 40 feet across the parking lot. And to the side of the blood trail near the car, the police found 4 brass bullet casings that they believed were fired from a semi-automatic .40 caliber or .44 caliber weapon. And then, not long after Thompson and the others had found these bullet casings, Thompson got word that Rusty had unfortunately passed away at the hospital. Thompson was now officially leading a homicide investigation for the first time. While Detective Thompson searched the preschool parking lot for more evidence, Rusty's wife, Andrea, sat at her desk in GE's Atlanta offices. A minute later, her phone rang, and she noticed the call was coming in from her son's preschool. And so Andrea immediately answered, and the preschool administrator on the other line sounded very upset. She said Andrea's son was just fine, but Andrea needed to come to the school immediately. So without thinking, Andrea grabbed her things and ran outside to her car, and as she was running towards it, she pulled out her phone and called her boss Hemi to let him know she was dealing with some kind of an emergency, and then she got in her car and sped back towards the suburbs. As soon as Andrea pulled into the preschool parking lot, she saw all these police officers who turned and looked at her, and immediately they walked right up to her, and so she rolled her window down, and they said, "You have to go to the hospital right now." Andrea demanded to know what was going on. Was her son really okay? And the police assured her her son was absolutely safe, but she still needed to go to the hospital right now. And when Andrea arrived at the hospital a few minutes later, there she would learn her husband had been gunned down in the preschool parking lot and had died shortly after. Detective Thompson spent most of the day in the preschool parking lot, working with the forensics team to see if there was any useful evidence they could find beyond just the bullet casings. But they didn't find much of anything else. So Thompson knew his biggest clues right then were that the killer had a beard and drove a silver minivan. None of the witnesses had gotten the license plate of this silver minivan, but Thompson had already called in an alert, so all the police departments in the area would be on the lookout for any vehicle that could possibly be a match. Thompson also arranged for a forensic sketch artist to meet with the witnesses and make a composite drawing of the shooter from all of their descriptions. By the time the sun set, Thompson already felt tired and a little overwhelmed, but he had no intention of stopping. So he got in his car and drove to Andrea and Rusty's house. Once he got there and parked his car, he stepped outside into the cool fall air. It was just above 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And just a second later, he heard somebody calling his name. Thompson looked over and saw his boss, Sergeant Gary Cordellino, standing by his own car at the curb. Cordellino still wanted Thompson to take the lead on this case, but he knew the detective did not have a lot of experience working homicide cases, so he said he would just be there to help. Thompson thanked Cordellino for coming, and the two men walked up to the house together. Cordellino's strong New York accent was a major contrast to the soft southern drawl a lot of people in town spoke with. But just like Rusty and Andrea, Cordellino had come to consider this small town in Georgia home, even if he was originally an outsider from up north. Andrea opened up the front door, and it was clear she'd been crying. The detectives introduced themselves and asked if they could please come inside. But Andrea got a stern look on her face. She said her parents and her in-laws were there, and this was a house of mourning. She thought it was very disrespectful that the police would want to intrude so soon after her husband had died. But Detective Thompson was just not going to have this. He said they were investigating a murder, and they needed to ask her and the family some questions right now. But Andrea just repeated herself. The family was in mourning, and they had no intention of speaking to police right now. At this point, Thompson got an angry look on his face, and he was about to push Andrea further, but Sergeant Cordellino jumped in. He said they were very sorry for her and her family's loss, and then apologized to Andrea for disturbing her and her family at such a difficult time, and said they would come back the following day. Andrea's face softened, and then she thanked him and said she would be willing to talk to them tomorrow. She closed the door, and then the two detectives walked back towards their respective cars. Thompson couldn't believe what had just happened. Clearly, they needed to interview the victim's wife, like right now. But Cordellino told him that in his experience, grief could do some really strange things to people, and they were way better off not pushing Andrea right at this moment. Still, Cordellino did admit that it was worth noting that Andrea did not seem remotely eager to help. The following day, November 19th, 2010, Detective Thompson and Sergeant Cordellino returned to Andrea and Rusty's house, this time with a warrant to search the premises. Andrea still did not seem thrilled to have the police in her home, and she thought the warrant was totally unnecessary, but she still led them into the kitchen, and she and her family sat down and spoke to them. Over the course of about 2 hours, the detectives met with Andrea, her parents, Rusty's parents, and his brother. And they all pretty much said the same thing. Rusty was a great guy, people who knew him loved him, and they just couldn't imagine who would want to hurt him. This didn't surprise Thompson and Cordellino. Families often painted their dead relatives in the best possible light. It's just what you do, it's your family. Andrea told the detectives she couldn't think of anybody who fit the description of the bearded man that witnesses had seen. Then after she said it, she immediately shook her head like she had just remembered something. She said in all of the chaos and grief, she'd almost forgotten something really huge. The detectives asked what she meant, and Andrea said about a week earlier, Rusty had seen this weird guy with earmuffs on and a mustache laying in their front yard for no reason right as he was taking their son to school. Rusty had been so freaked out by seeing this guy who kind of inexplicably ran away that he called the police and gave a description of the guy. And again, part of that description was saying that this guy had this big black mustache. Thompson and Cordellino looked at each other. It was definitely possible the man with the big mustache and the earmuffs had grown out a full beard, and then by the time he was shooting Rusty, that's what you saw, his full beard, and not just a mustache. So maybe the shooter really was the same person Rusty had seen in the front yard. They talked to Andrea a bit longer, and then at some point they told her they wanted to take her and Rusty's computers to be searched. And again, Andrea got very upset. Detective Thompson thought it was strange that she still seemed unwilling to do whatever it took to help police find her husband's killer. But the detectives, in truth, did not really need Andrea to give them permission because they had a warrant. So they took the computers, then they thanked Rusty's family for talking to them, and then they left. Back at the station, Thompson and Cordellino handed off the computers for forensic data analysis, and then they dug up the report Rusty had filed about this weird guy he'd seen in his front yard. At that point, the detectives only knew there was a guy with this big mustache who might also be the big bearded guy who shot Rusty. It was not much to go on, and nobody in Rusty's family or anybody from the preschool remotely recognized this bearded guy. Then, something came to Thompson. He remembered what one of the witnesses had said, that the shooter seemed to be utterly calm when he walked up and shot and killed Rusty. And so Thompson floated the idea that, what if the shooter was a professional hitman who somebody had hired to kill Rusty? That would make sense because nobody would know who he was, and maybe he was wearing a disguise or something, and he certainly would be very calm walking up to do the killing because this is what he did professionally. And surprisingly, Cordellino did not think this was a far-fetched idea at all. In fact, he said, if this guy Rusty saw in the yard was also the shooter, this hitman potentially, he could have been at the house that day tracking Rusty's movements and learning his routines, something a professional killer would likely do. And when the detectives began delving into emails and other information they had found on Rusty and Andrea's computers, the hired killer theory only began to make more sense. The detectives found that during his time working as a chief financial officer, Rusty had clashed repeatedly with the business owners. And based on the emails, he and Andrea were not shy about telling other people exactly how they felt about those men. Also, since Rusty had begun working on creating his own company, the Celebrity Voicemail Company, he'd worked closely with a business partner as well as several potential investors. So there was a chance that maybe Rusty had just angered the wrong people when talking trash about his former bosses, or maybe he'd had a financial dispute with someone who was working with him on his new business. The detectives kept digging into Rusty and Andrea's computer data, but they also knew they could break everything wide open if they could just locate the silver minivan the shooter had been driving. So, with the help of other police departments in the state, they expanded the search radius for this minivan beyond just the Atlanta metropolitan area. And so soon, police were scouring security camera footage from roads and stores surrounding the city. The detectives also put together a list of people who might have had the motive and the money to hire a hitman to take Rusty out. On November 21st, 2010, so 3 days after Rusty's murder, sheets hung over the mirrors in Rusty and Andrea's house, and friends and family sat together on low stools in the front room. Rusty's funeral had taken place earlier that day, and now the people who had been closest to him were sitting Shiva. Shiva is a Jewish tradition in which family and friends gather together to mourn a dead loved one. They'll say prayers and often receive condolence calls from others. At the house, Andrea thanked her boss, Hemi, and her GE coworkers for coming. They had all been so worried about her when she got that call saying something was wrong at her son's preschool, but none of them could have imagined that that call would eventually lead to this. A little while later, Andrea's boss, Hemi, began to lead the whole group in a prayer. Over 100 members of Hemi's extended family had actually died in the Holocaust, and so that had always inspired him to remain an active member of the Jewish community and to provide any help he could to those close to him, like Andrea. But while Andrea was sitting Shiva and listening to Hemi give this prayer, Detective Thompson and Cordellino just could not shake the feeling that Andrea had to be somehow involved in her husband's death. The police were still desperately trying to find the shooter's silver minivan, but their potential hired hitman theory had also led them to delve into Rusty's finances. and they had discovered that Andrea stood to get a $2 million payout from Rusty's life insurance policy. So along with being the murder victim's spouse, which by default made them a huge potential suspect, Andrea also had a clear financial motive to want her husband dead. And on top of that, she really had not seemed like she wanted to cooperate with police. And so the detectives decided they had to speak to Andrea again, but this time they wanted to isolate her from the rest of her family. On November 24th, almost a week after the murder, Thompson and Cordellino sat down with Andrea in an interview room at the police station. Andrea tucked her brown hair behind her ear, adjusted her glasses, and stared across a small white table at the two detectives. Thompson and Cordellino could tell Andrea was all business, and that she still clearly resented having to speak with the police. But they still started by thanking her for coming in, and then they asked her how her relationship had been with her husband prior to his murder. Andrea admitted things had gotten a bit strained between them when Rusty lost his job, but she said they'd worked through that. And other than typical husband and wife arguments, they actually got along really well. Andrea seemed totally matter-of-fact when she answered these questions. On the one hand, the detectives thought that made her seem almost unfeeling about her husband's death, like she didn't care. But Cordellino realized that this was a woman dealing with an impossible situation. Also, she was used to being in high-powered business meetings, so maybe this was just the way she conducted herself. Then, at some point, Cordellino asked Andrea if it was possible that Rusty could have been having an affair. Was there a jealous lover out there who might have had it out for him? But Andrea didn't flinch. She sort of half smiled and said the idea that Rusty was cheating on her was absurd. He was one of the most loving, supportive people she had ever met. He would never, ever do something like that to their family. So the detectives moved from Andrea and Rusty's personal relationship to their financial situation. But nothing Andrea said indicated that she would have killed Rusty for his life insurance policy. Rusty had put a lot of money away during his time working, and she got paid well at GE, so really, money was not an issue for them. So eventually, the detectives wrapped up the interview and thanked Andrea for her time. But after she left, Thompson and Cordellino felt like they didn't know much more than they did before she showed up. And for the life of them, they could not decide if that was because Andrea really just didn't know anyone who would want to hurt her husband, or if she was hiding something. In the weeks following that interview, no new leads came in, and Thompson and Cordellino began to get frustrated. They still didn't know if the man with the earmuffs and the mustache that Rusty had seen at the house was also the bearded shooter, or if those were two totally different people. And the detectives didn't know if this full bearded shooter had been hired by somebody else, or if it was someone who knew Rusty, that they had somehow overlooked that maybe had a specific reason to attack Rusty. But then, in mid-December, so about a month after Rusty's murder, Detective Thompson was sitting at his desk when one of his team members rushed over to him, and this young cop had a huge smile on his face. Thompson asked him what was going on, and the young cop said he'd been re-watching surveillance footage of the silver minivan as it drove down a street near the preschool. There still was not a clear shot of the license plate, but the young cop had spotted a small white sticker on the van's windshield that nobody had caught before. And he was sure that that was the type of sticker that rental car companies used to track their vehicles. Immediately, Detective Thompson stood up, full of energy. The young cop said, the sticker didn't point to a specific rental car company, but Thompson just put his hand up and said, nope, that doesn't matter. This is a huge discovery. Armed with this new information about this sticker, police reached out to and visited rental car companies all across the area. And after about a week or so of searching, they finally found a silver Kia Sedona minivan at a rental car lot 25 miles north of Dunwoody. And that van could absolutely match the shooter's vehicle. And when they checked that minivan's recent rental history, Thompson and Cordellino immediately recognized the name that came up. And they were sure right then and there they had found Rusty's killer. Based on information from the rental car company, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted during the investigation, this is what police think happened to Rusty Snyderman on the morning of November 18, 2010. On that day at about 5:45 a.m., the killer heard the voice of the angel ringing in his head. That voice, that sounded just like Olivia Newton-John, had told the killer that time was running out. People were in danger, and the killer had their marching orders. This mission had to be accomplished now. The killer climbed into a silver minivan and then pulled out into the dark, empty early morning streets. The killer drove slowly, moving from dark to light as the van passed under each street lamp. Finally, they pulled the van onto Rusty and Andrea's street about an hour before the sun would rise. They parked their car a few houses down from Rusty's, and then they waited. But soon, the killer noticed lights turning on in some of the houses as people got ready for work and school and their morning routine. So the killer drove the van out of the neighborhood and found a spot on the street not too far from Rusty's son's preschool. The killer sat in the van, occasionally hearing the sound of the angel's voice encouraging them. And then at some point, the killer leaned over, opened up the glove box, and pulled out a semi-automatic pistol. They checked to make sure the gun was loaded, and when they saw it was, the killer laid down on the passenger seat. As the sun rose, the killer continued to just lay there, breathing very slowly in and out, very rhythmically, to ensure they remained calm. Then finally, around 9 a.m., the killer sat up and saw Rusty's Infiniti driving down the street towards them. The killer let Rusty drive by, and then quickly pulled out of their parking space, and then slowly tailed Rusty all the way to the preschool parking lot, and once they got there, the killer parked a few spaces away from Rusty's car. The killer watched as Rusty led his son into the preschool and began chatting with some parents inside of the doorway. As Rusty did this, the killer grabbed the gun off the passenger seat and held it in their lap. Then, a few minutes later, the killer saw Rusty walking back towards his car. At this point, the killer opened up the minivan door and, calm as can be, walked across the parking lot. Rusty had managed to open up his car door, but by that point, the killer was practically on top of him. The killer got within 3 feet of Rusty, raised their gun, and fired. The bullet struck Rusty on the left side of the jaw, traveling through his right shoulder and then lodged in his back. Rusty immediately collapsed to the ground, blood pouring out of his face and seeping through his shirt. The killer turned to walk back to the minivan, but then quickly wheeled back around and fired 3 more shots into Rusty's abdomen as he lay dying on the asphalt. After that, the killer turned and walked back to the minivan, got in, threw it in reverse, peeled out of the parking space, and then sped out of the lot. In the rearview mirror, the killer could see people running over to Rusty on the ground, but the killer felt confident they had killed Rusty and that the angel and demon would now be satisfied. A few minutes later, the killer pulled the van out onto a highway and disappeared into traffic. They drove for a while, exited off the highway, and then headed into a town 25 miles away from Dunwoody. There, they drove the van to the rental car company where they had gotten it, and they pulled it into the return lot. They checked the rearview mirror and looked out the windows. Nobody was nearby, so the killer reached up and yanked the brown wig off their head and also peeled the big fake beard off their face. The killer then stuffed the disguise pieces into a bag, got out of their rental car, and walked to a nearby auto repair shop where they had dropped off their real car for a minor repair the day before. The killer quickly paid for the work on their car and then drove off, headed towards General Electric's Atlanta offices. Some members of the investigative team had remained convinced that Rusty's wife Andrea had killed Rusty, but it turned out the shooter was somebody else who worked at GE. Andrea's boss, Hemi Newman. Police had talked to Hemi when they interviewed Andrea's friends and coworkers, but they didn't really focus on him as a potential suspect until they discovered the minivan at the rental car company. Hemi had used his real name to rent that car, and seeing Hemi's name on the rental form led Thompson and Cordolino back to Andrea's computer. And it turned out that she and Hemi had exchanged a number of emails that led police to believe their relationship was far more than just boss and employee. After police traced the rental van to Hemi, they interviewed and then arrested him. But they continued to push Andrea because they believed she and Hemi had worked together to kill Rusty, 2 lovers who wanted to be rid of Andrea's husband. That's when things got really weird. Hemi admitted to being in love with Andrea, and he even suggested that they had had an affair, though Andrea denied it. Still, Hemi said he did not arrange Rusty's murder with Andrea. Instead, he was simply following orders passed down to him from a demon and an angel who happened to sound like popular singers from the 1970s and 1980s. Talking to a psychiatrist, Hemi admitted that the Barry White-sounding demon had been visiting him for decades, dating back to when he was in college. But it was not until that angel appeared to him in the car on the night he had gone to Rusty and Andrea's house, and Rusty had talked about this new idea that he was going to make this company around celebrity voicemails, that Hemi understood his role in the cosmic battle of good versus evil. According to Hemi, the angel told him that Rusty was a threat to Andrea and the kids. In fact, the angel said Hemi was the true father of Andrea's son and daughter. And apparently, Rusty had found this out. This is again according to the angel. And so Rusty was bound to eventually murder his wife and kids as a result. That is, unless Hemi stopped Rusty by killing him first. To carry out this mission, Hemi first bought a big fake black mustache and slapped it on his face along with some earmuffs, and he spied on Rusty at his house. But of course, Rusty caught him laying on the front yard, but Rusty had no idea it was actually Hemi because the disguise worked. And then after that, when Hemi learned Rusty's routine, he bought a different disguise, the wig and the big fake beard, for the day of the murder. In court, Hemi's defense team entered an insanity plea and then proceeded to trace Hemi's complete and disturbed history with this demon and angel. But the prosecution never bought any of this. They remained convinced that Hemi had concocted this whole story to avoid life in prison. They also believed that Andrea Snyderman, not some angel or demon, was the one who actually put Hemi up to murdering her husband. The jury found Hemi guilty of murder, but they also deemed him mentally ill. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, and as of 2024, he is incarcerated at the Augusta State Medical Prison. But after Hemi's conviction, police and the DA stayed focused on Andrea. She was eventually arrested and charged with murder, along with multiple other counts. But the murder charge was dropped, and she was never tried in connection to her husband's death. However, Andrea was found guilty on multiple counts that pertained to hindering the murder investigation. Andrea would go on to serve just 22 months of a 5-year prison sentence, and when she got out of prison, she received the $2 million from Rusty's life insurance policy and maintained custody of her 2 kids.
Most people don't know is you can't just put scuba tanks on and then dive down to any depth and come right back up again. The compressed air inside of those scuba tanks would be a mixture of oxygen as well as most likely helium and nitrogen. And when you're breathing that compressed air, the oxygen would get breathed up and then not linger inside of your body. But the other inert gases, the helium and the nitrogen, they would be breathed up and then absorbed into your bloodstream, and they would stay there until you resurfaced. Now, it's completely harmless as long as you understand how it works getting those gases out of your body. In a nutshell, as you ascend, these inert gases will leave your body on their own, but it's a gradual process. If you rocket to the surface before this takes place, these inert gases will not leave your body and they'll expand inside of you, and your body will become the equivalent of a shaken up soda can. And so at best, having all these bubbles inside of you is very painful. At worst, it's lethal. The term for this condition is decompression sickness, but it's better known as the bends. The way divers protect themselves from getting the bends is on their ascent, they do what's called a decompression stop. This is something that is planned into the dive where they stop at a certain depth for a certain amount of time, and that guarantees the inert gases have diffused out of their body before they reach the surface. Now, the deeper you go, the more decompression stops you'll have to do, and the longer they will take. For example, ascending from 2,000 feet would take over 33 hours to do safely. But luckily, none of us are trying to dive down to 2,000 feet. Well, unless you're trying to be an oil and gas saturation diver. Saturation divers, or SAT divers, do construction and demolition at depths of up to 2,000 feet below the surface. But they don't spend 33 hours ascending after every single dive. Instead, after their dives, they're artificially kept at their working depth. The way this works is the SAT diver climbs inside of a pressure chamber on board a ship or on board an oil rig, and this chamber also doubles as their living quarters. There's beds and there's a bathroom, but it's laughably small and uncomfortable. It looks like a small submarine. And once they go inside, they seal the door and then they pressurize it to match the depth that they're going to be working at the bottom of the ocean. And then also there's another pressure chamber called the dive bell that's connected directly onto the side of the chamber, and that's also pressurized to match the working depth. When it was time for the SAT diver to go to work, they would put their dive gear on inside of the chamber, they would crawl directly into the dive bell, they would shut the door behind them and seal it, and then people outside of the dive bell would physically disconnect it from the chamber, and then using a crane, they would place it in the water and then lower it down to their working depth. And once they get down there, because the pressure inside the bell is equal to the pressure outside the bell, they can just slide open a door on the bottom and the water does not come inside. And so the divers do slip through this hole and they do the work they need to do. And when they're done, they come back inside the dive bell, they shut it up, and then using the radio, they communicate with the people up on the boat or up on the rig, and they raise the bell back up, they reattach them to the chamber, they go inside, they take their stuff off, there's bunk beds and there's a bathroom inside of the chamber, and that's where they hang out until their next dive. This process is repeated for days and days and days, keeping them saturated with these gases. And then at the end of their shift, which is usually about a month long, they will have one long decompression they do inside of the chamber. While this system is highly efficient, it does not change the fact that saturation diving is extremely dangerous and terrifying. The sun doesn't reach below 700 feet, so most of the time these divers are in complete and total darkness. And it's unbelievably cold down there. And so their suits have hot water pumped into them through a tether that's connected to the dive bell. But if that were to fail, hypothermia would kick in almost immediately. They have flashlights, but the water is so full of sediment around the areas that they work that shining the light is basically like shining it into fog. You can't really see very far besides right in front of your face. Sat divers also report that sometimes the water around them will suddenly move violently, and they'll look around, but their crummy light and lack of visibility means they can't see what it was, but they know it's a large animal that's checking them out. Other times, these fairly large fish will swim right up to them and come right under their light. It's almost like they're being affectionate with the diver. But they're not being affectionate. They're trying to hide behind the sat diver from some large predator that's out there watching them. Experienced sat divers have learned to just accept their harsh environment down there and don't easily get scared. But there is one thing that all sat divers are afraid of, and that is a lost bell. When sat divers are down at their working depth, the dive bell that's brought them down there is usually situated right next to them, just kind of floating in the water. And this dive bell is connected to the ship or the oil rig above by a cable. And if that cable were to snap, the dive bell would fall to the bottom and it would take with it the divers because they're always tethered to the dive bell. If the divers survived the crash to the ocean floor, they would then just be trapped and have to hope that someone comes down to get them at some point before they run out of air or they succumb to hypothermia. While a lost bell scenario is incredibly rare, it has happened before. On August 7th, 1979, Richard Walker was inside of a pressure chamber on board a ship in the North Sea. He was a saturation diver who for the past 10 days had been in saturation and honestly was just over it. He wanted to go home to his wife and his 15-month-old daughter. That evening, before his scheduled dive, he wrote in his journal, "Dear God, I just want to get out." Soon after writing this entry, he and his partner, Victor Giel, put on their dive gear and hopped into the dive bell. The bell was detached from the chamber and then brought over to the side of the ship, and right before they lowered it into the water, somebody noticed the location transponder that basically beamed up where it was down below had become loose, and so the decision was made to just remove it. And so after they pulled it off, they lowered the dive bell onto the water and then slowly lowered it down to their working depth, which was 485 feet. Once they got down there, they opened up the hole at the bottom of the bell, and then they began taking turns exiting the bell to go work on this underwater structure. A few hours later, at 2:45 in the morning, Richard was the one outside of the dive bell, and he heard something behind him, and he turned around, and he saw the dive bell had slightly tilted on its side. Right as he noticed this, the radio in his helmet kicked on and told him he needed to go back inside the dive bell immediately, and they were going to try to pull them back up. And so Richard went inside the bell, he closed the hole behind him, and then he and Victor listened to the radio as they told them that the main cable holding the dive bell had slipped out. Now, this main cable was not the only thing connecting the dive bell up to the ship. There was also another clump of wires and tubes that was called the umbilical that ran all their power and hot water and their comms down to the dive bell. But this umbilical was not meant to be load-bearing. But as it stood with this main cable gone, the umbilical was holding the dive bell from slipping to the bottom of the ocean. And so the crew up on the ship decided their only choice was to use the umbilical to reel this dive bell back in. And so they began pulling them up by the umbilical, and almost immediately it completely snapped, and the dive bell fell to the bottom of the ocean about 50 feet below. Now, normally a dive bell would have what's called a clump weight hanging off the bottom of it. And in an emergency, you could detach this clump weight, and the dive bell is buoyant enough it would go up to the surface. But Richard and Victor's company had cut corners and not used a clump weight, and instead attached weights directly to the dive bell, which meant when they hit the ocean floor, the actual dive bell was sitting on the ocean floor, where that hole they would normally escape from was pressed into the seabed, so they could not get out of their dive bell. Whereas if there had been a clump weight, the clump weight would have hit the ground and the dive bell would have hovered slightly over it. And so worst case scenario, they could have gotten out and done a wet transfer into another dive bell. So with the umbilical cut, they had no radio communication, they had no heat, they had no light, and they had very little remaining oxygen. And so all they could do was just sit in darkness and hope somebody rescues them. Less than 30 minutes later, another dive ship arrived and offered to help. Now, they were not expecting to dive that night, so it took about 3 hours before they actually had their rescue divers in the water. And unfortunately, because the location transponder had been removed from the dive bell before Richard and Victor went under, it made it almost impossible for these rescue divers to find it. But after an hour of looking around, they finally found it. It was 7 a.m. and they went right down to the porthole and they shined a light inside of the dive bell. And inside, Richard and Victor are given a thumbs up like, hey, we're okay. We're just ready to get rescued. The fact that Richard and Victor were okay was communicated back up to the surface, and everybody on top was so excited, so relieved. And in fact, they called Richard's wife and they told her that, hey, there's been an accident, but your husband's just fine. He'll be out very soon. But despite these rescue divers locating the dive bell, because the ship up above that they were attached to kept moving around, it was proving to be extremely difficult for them to stay over the dive bell. And so for the next 2 hours, these rescue divers desperately tried to thread a new wire through the top of the dive bell, but it was going so poorly, and they kept going around and shining their light into the porthole to check on Richard and Victor. And it was very clear that their situation was getting worse and worse by the second. They were not giving thumbs up and smiling. They looked panicked and desperate, and they'd been without heat now for hours, and it was obvious they were running out of oxygen. Finally, at 9 a.m., so 6 hours after Richard and Victor had first hit the sea floor, the rescue divers managed to get a new cable through the top of the dive bell. And before they signaled to have it brought back up again, they shined a light through the porthole to check on them one more time, and they saw that Richard and Victor were just sitting there with their head in their hands. They were clearly still alive and lucid, but it was like they understood they have very little time left, and if this doesn't work, they're doomed. At this point, the rescue divers called up and said it was ready. They got pulled up to the surface, and then the ship began pulling up the dive bell, and almost immediately, the cable snapped. And everybody up on the surface knew that at this point, it was almost impossible for them to survive. But nonetheless, rescue divers went down, and it took a while to find the dive bell because it had moved. But when they did, they shined the light through the porthole, and Richard and Victor were still very much alive, but they were not looking to interact with the divers at the window anymore. They were just sitting there looking down. They were despondent. It was like they were making peace with what they understood was going to happen. They were not going to get out of there. And over the course of the next several hours, as these rescue divers tried desperately to get a new cable through the top of the dive bell, they kept checking on Richard and Victor, and each time they checked, they would slouch lower and lower in their seats until both of them were laying on their side. And then finally, the rescue divers got a cable through the top, and then afterwards, they went back up to the ship, and then the ship was able this time to pull the dive bell up and back on board, but when they opened the door, both Richard and Victor had passed away.
Our next story is called The Escape.
On August 6th, 2018, a manager at a grocery store in Lancaster, California, which is a town about an hour north of Los Angeles, started getting complaints from his staff and from customers about a terrible smell coming from the front of the building. The manager, who had come in the back door that day and so hadn't smelled anything, began walking through the store towards the front in order to investigate. He only made it to the cash registers before he had to throw his arm over his mouth and his nose because the whole front half of the store reeked. The manager's first thought was that food must have somehow fallen somewhere out of view and it was rotting, and that was causing the smell. But when he went past the cash registers and went out the front doors, the smell got exponentially worse, and he noticed the smell was predominantly coming from this brown liquid on the ground that seemed to be leaking out of the base of one of the pillars that lined the front of the store. And so the manager thought, well, it can't be food that's causing the smell. It's got to be a sewer pipe leak that's happened right underneath this pillar, and it's seeping up through the cement, and that's what's causing the smell. And so the manager went back inside the store and he called a plumber, and then a couple of hours later, the plumber showed up. The manager pointed at the brown liquid out on the front and explained what he thought was going on, and the plumber looked at it and then looked at the manager and said, there's no sewer pipe underneath here. So whatever that liquid is, it's coming from inside the pillar. And so the manager was stumped because this pillar and all the others in the front of the store were purely decorative. There's no reason anything would be leaking out from inside of them. There was nothing inside of them. And so the manager asked the plumber to pull off one of the bricks around the area where this liquid was coming from so they could see what was on the other side. And so the plumber got his crowbar and he began prying off one of the bricks. And then once it was loose enough, he pulled the brick away, revealing an opening into the pillar. And the two men got down and they looked inside, and what they saw horrified them. And they immediately backed up and they called the police. 5 days earlier, a 35-year-old man named Ray Rivera was pulled over by Lancaster, California police on suspicion of driving a stolen vehicle. As soon as the officer got out of their cruiser and began approaching Ray's vehicle, Ray peeled off down the road, turned the corner, and was gone. The officer immediately got back in their cruiser and took off after Ray, but he had gotten a huge jump start and he had fled into a highly populated and busy area where it would be relatively easy to blend in and disappear. The officer called for backup, and before long there were dozens of other cop cars in the area looking for Ray, but no one could find him. A little while later, the police heard over the radio that a car matching the description of the one Ray had been driving had just crashed into a local grocery store. And so the police head over to the grocery store, and sure enough, there's Ray's white pickup truck crashed into the side of the building, but Ray is nowhere to be found. The police began asking witnesses at the store if they had seen the man driving the white pickup truck, and a few said they had. They said after he crashed, he leapt out of the vehicle and he ran inside the grocery store and then went up a flight of stairs to the staff-only area. The police went inside the grocery store and searched the staff-only area, and they searched the rest of the grocery store, but he wasn't there. And so they assumed at some point after going inside, he managed to slip back out again and had escaped on foot. And so the police, just as a precaution, stayed outside of this grocery store for several more hours in case if Ray was in there, they would catch him trying to leave. But after a couple of hours, he never did. And so they put out a warrant for his arrest and they left. Well, it would turn out Ray had run inside the grocery store, but he had never left. After running up to that staff-only area, he found a crawl space and he hid inside of it for several hours until the police left. And then at some point that evening, he decided he wanted to find a better hiding spot, and so he made his way onto the roof. Now, it's not entirely clear how he did that. Either the crawl space he was in directly connected to the roof, or he got out of the crawl space and then found his way onto the roof another way. But regardless, he found his way onto the roof, and when he got up there, he realized the roof was totally flat until you got to the very front edge of the building, the part that looked down into the parking lot. There, on the roof, was this small structure that was built up just on the front end of the roof that gave the impression, from the parking lot looking up, that this building was a lot bigger than it really was. On the backside of this phony structure was a door that was accessible from the roof. Ray saw this access door and ran over to it. He tried the handle and it was unlocked. And so he opened it up and he went inside. Now, this attic-like space that sat on the front of the building really didn't have that much of a purpose to it. However, it did provide access to the insides of all of the pillars that lined the front of the store. And so it's believed that Ray, as soon as he walked inside, saw these openings and believed one of them would be the perfect hiding place. And so he lowered himself feet first into one of these hollow chutes. He got his feet and his legs, his hips, and most of his torso into this tight 9-inch by 17-inch space, but his shoulders were too broad. They would not fit into the pillar. And so he raised one arm over his head and he kept his other arm pinned by his side in order to make himself as narrow as possible. And this worked. Inch by inch, he began sliding deeper and deeper into this 2-story tall pillar until he was completely out of sight. But as soon as his shoulders had gone down into that pillar, he would have realized he had made a grave mistake. With one arm pinned above his head and the other pinned by his side, he would not have been able to pull himself back up out of this narrow space. He was stuck. And so he probably began squirming and trying to use his feet to try to get back up into the attic space, but all of that movement only made him slip farther and farther down into this pillar until his feet touched the ground at the absolute bottom. And so not only is he already in this totally compromised position that would have made it hard to breathe, he was also in such a narrow space that the walls of this pillar literally were crushing his chest, making it nearly impossible to get a full breath of air. And when he screamed out for help, nobody would have heard him because he was entombed inside of multiple layers of cement and brick. Also, making an already horrible situation that much worse, Lancaster, California was experiencing a very significant heat wave that month. And so all day long, the sun would have been blazing down on the outside of that pillar, heating up the inside like an oven. 5 days after Ray got trapped, the plumber removed that brick on the pillar, and he and the store manager bent down and looked, and they saw Ray's leg. The smelly brown liquid that had been coming out of the pillar that had alerted everyone to this in the first place was purge fluid, which is something that comes out of a decomposing body.
The next and final story of today's episode is called The Chute.
On July 30th, 2013, 56-year-old Roger Miro grabbed a bag of trash from his apartment and then walked out into the hall. He turned right and walked down the hall until he reached the trash chute, which was right on the side of the wall. He opened it up. It was like a mailbox. He opened it up. He dropped his trash bag inside. He closed the trash chute and then walked back to his apartment. When he got back inside, he instinctively reached down to his right pocket to grab his cell phone, but it wasn't there. So he grabbed his left pocket, wasn't there either. He checked his back pockets, he's fishing around, and he realizes he doesn't have his phone. So he figures, okay, I must have put it down somewhere in my apartment. Now, Roger was legally blind, so it made looking for small things in his apartment quite difficult. But nonetheless, he began looking all over his apartment for his phone. He started in the kitchen, he looked all over the place, checked all the surfaces, no cell phone. He went to the living room, to the bedroom, to the bathroom, but there was no cell phone. And so Roger thought maybe when he walked to the trash chute, he might have dropped the phone in the hallway. And so he left his apartment, he turned right, and he walked along, retracing his footsteps all the way to the trash chute. But all along the way, there was no phone on the ground. And so as he's standing in front of the opening to this trash chute, he thinks to himself, maybe I accidentally put my phone in the trash bag that I have now just dropped down this trash chute. And so as Roger is standing there wondering what he's supposed to do, one of his neighbors walked out into the hall and looked down and saw Roger standing there kind of inquisitively looking at this opening to the trash chute. And they asked Roger, what's going on? And Roger explained the whole phone situation. And the neighbor said, well, hey, why don't you go down to the first floor and ask the manager if you can get the key to the trash room on the first floor where all the trash goes. And so Roger said, thank you very much. He turned and made his way to the elevator, and the neighbor went back inside of his apartment. Roger went down to the first floor. He went to the manager's office. He knocked on the door, and when the door opened, the manager was obviously very busy with something. And Roger would say, hey, I'm just looking to get into the trash room. I think I might have accidentally thrown my phone away, and I just want to have a look in the trash to see if I can find it. Now, this manager knew he was not allowed to let anybody who lived in the apartment complex go into that trash room on their own. It was a dangerous space. And so the manager was supposed to go in there with them if they needed to go in and look around in the trash. But right when Roger went up to the manager's office, the manager was waiting for a very important phone call and so couldn't really leave his office. But the manager kind of empathized with Roger and felt bad for him and said, okay, you know what? I'll just give you the key. You can go in there on your own and go looking for your cell phone. I hope you find it. And when you're done, just bring the key back here. And so Roger said, thank you very much. He took the key, he left the office, and he made his way down the hall to the trash room. And when he got there, he unlocked the lock and went inside. A few hours later, Roger's wife came home from work, and when she got to the apartment, Roger wasn't in there. She tried calling his cell phone, but he didn't pick up. And so she walked around the apartment hoping there would be some indication of where he might have gone, like a letter or something, but there was nothing. And so Roger's wife was really concerned about this because this was totally out of character for her husband to go out at night on his own. And so she, operating on a gut instinct, called the police and reported him missing. And so a few minutes later, 2 police officers show up at this apartment building. They go up to Roger's apartment, they speak to Roger's wife, and then they go into the hall and they knock on some doors of other neighbors in the area. And after speaking with them, one of the neighbors who had seen Roger earlier said, hey, he lost his phone. And the last I spoke to him, he was going to go down to the trash room to try to see if he could find his phone down there. And so the officers go down to the first floor, they go to the trash room, and they try the door, and it's unlocked. And when they open up the door and they look inside, right in the middle of this totally nondescript windowless room that basically looked like a basement, was this huge green dumpster. And above the green dumpster, high up on the ceiling, was this round opening. And that was the bottom of the trash chute. So when people like Roger and the other people who lived in this apartment building dropped their trash down their respective trash chute on each floor, the trash would come tumbling down and literally fall out of the ceiling into the dumpster. Now, this dumpster was unique. It was not like other dumpsters where the top was just wide open and anyone could lob a bag of trash in. No, this dumpster, only the left side of the dumpster had an opening for trash. The rest of the dumpster was completely welded shut. There was no way into it. And so on the left side, where this dumpster opened up to allow trash to come in, it was positioned right underneath that opening in the ceiling where the trash came tumbling down. And it wasn't just an opening. It was like this near vertical tunnel that was welded onto the top of this dumpster. And it went straight up and it had this big open mouth at the top, almost like a funnel. And it was there to catch the trash as it fell down. And it would go down this tunnel down into the dumpster. And so the gap between the ceiling and the top of this near vertical tunnel, this chute, was maybe 3 or 4 feet. And so when these officers looked into this room and they saw this dumpster and the chute and this hole in the ceiling, they also saw a ladder had been propped up on the left side of the dumpster right up against that near vertical tunnel, as if someone was trying to look down into the dumpster itself. And so one of the officers walked over, they climbed up the ladder, and when they looked down into this tunnel, down into the dumpster, they found Roger. After a lengthy investigation, this is what is believed to have happened to him. After Roger got that key from the manager, he went to the trash room, he opened it up, and then he went inside and found this huge dumpster. And he would have quickly realized the only way to look into the dumpster, and so to go looking for his phone, was to look down into this tunnel. There was a ladder nearby, so he grabbed it and he propped it up against the side of the dumpster, and he climbed up on top and he looked down into the tunnel, down into the dumpster, and as he was looking, either some trash from the ceiling fell down and struck him, causing him to lose his balance, or he just slipped somehow. But either way, he lost his balance and he tumbled into the tunnel, down into the dumpster. And what Roger didn't know is as soon as that happened, he was doomed. Because this was not some ordinary dumpster. This was a trash compactor. And as soon as Roger fell down that tunnel, his body triggered an electronic sensor that activated the trash compactor. So the way this worked is there was this big metal ram inside the dumpster. There's a ram on one side, and once it gets activated, it will press. There's a hydraulic press that pushes it all the way to the other side. So any of the trash in this dumpster will get compressed against the other side of the dumpster. And then at that point, the ram comes all the way back. And so every time trash would come down that chute, it would trigger that sensor, the trash compactor would start, it would flatten the trash, and so on and so forth. And so Roger has fallen down into the dumpster, he's triggered this compactor, but he's legally blind, he's probably dazed from the fall, and so by the time he realizes what's going on and he's kind of looking around, there is a hydraulic press bearing down on him. And so he probably tried to jump up the tunnel to try to escape the dumpster, but there was no ladder inside this tunnel and it was nearly vertical, so there was no way to climb up and out of it. And inside of the dumpster itself, there was no emergency shutoff switch and there was no emergency exit. And so at some point, it's assumed that Roger realized he was not going to be able to climb up the tunnel. And so he only had one direction he could go, which was to retreat to the far side of the dumpster, as far away from the press as he possibly could be. But once he got over there, there was nowhere for him to go. And so he was forced to just wait as this hydraulic press slowly moved across until it finally reached him and crushed him. Now, we don't know if that very first hydraulic press actually killed Roger. All we know is Roger was trapped inside of this dumpster for several hours, and over that period of time, more and more trash was dropped down the chute, activating the press over and over and over again. And so by the time the police actually looked down into the dumpster, they saw a part of Roger's body, and immediately they could tell there was nothing they could do. Roger was definitely deceased. Roger's wife would sue the manager of the apartment building as well as the company that owned the apartment building for their negligence, but the outcomes of that case have not been made public.
On the evening of April 7th, 1990, 25-year-old Nancy Langert looked at the cardboard boxes stacked up in the living room of her home in Winnetka, Illinois, trying to figure out what else she still had to pack. She and her husband Richard were moving at the end of the month, and Nancy could not wait. She was almost 3 months pregnant, and the new house had a lot more space, including a room for the baby's nursery. But as Nancy scanned the room, she realized there really wasn't much left for her to do. Other than the boxes, the only things in the room were a TV, a stereo, a card table, and some folding chairs. The truth was that even though she and Richard had been staying in this small townhouse for months that was owned actually by her parents, they had never actually really settled in. It always felt like it was a temporary place to sort their finances out, after Richard had racked up some serious gambling debt. As soon as the thought of Richard's gambling crossed her mind, Nancy shook her head and then called for her little dog, Pepsi. She heard his nails clicking across the floor, and she picked him up and scratched under his chin, trying to take her mind off of Richard's gambling and their money issues. But it was no use. It was all she could think about. Both Nancy and Richard had good jobs working at a growing coffee company, but Richard had always liked to bet on sports. And at some point, he had started spending more than he earned and began also borrowing money from friends to keep up with his gambling. It had all come to a head months earlier when Nancy and Richard fell behind on bills and had to move into this townhouse owned by Nancy's parents. And then Nancy's mother had to create a budget for them and put them on a weekly allowance, which was very embarrassing for both of them. But recently, things had gotten a lot better. They'd paid down their debt, built up their savings again, and now they were about to move out of this temporary home. In fact, at this very moment, Nancy even had $500 in cash in her purse to deposit into her bank account. Nancy gave Pepsi a kiss and put him down on the floor, and she reminded herself to stay positive. Richard was trying hard to curb his spending, and other than his gambling issue, he really was a great husband. And Richard and Nancy had both wanted a baby for so long, and now it was finally happening, and she knew Richard was going to be an amazing father. Feeling better, Nancy sat down on a folding chair and flipped on the TV. At around 6:30 p.m., the phone rang. It was Richard, telling Nancy he was leaving work and he'd be home to pick her up in just a few minutes. They were celebrating Nancy's father's 60th birthday that night. They had an 8 p.m. dinner reservation, but they were picking up Nancy's parents and sister at her sister's place first. Nancy turned off the TV, picked up Pepsi, and took him upstairs to the bedroom so he wouldn't chew up any of the cardboard boxes while they were gone. After putting him inside, she shut the door gently, walked back downstairs, threw on a coat, and walked outside to Richard's car, shivering in the early spring chill. A few minutes later, Nancy's sister, Jean, opened the door to her apartment with a huge smile on her face. She led Nancy and Richard inside, and then she handed Nancy 2 beautifully wrapped presents that she'd brought back from a recent trip to Ireland. Nancy opened up the first gift and found a gorgeous Irish wool sweater inside. But the other present made Nancy feel like she might cry from happiness. It was a little onesie and booties for a newborn baby. Nancy thanked Jean repeatedly and gave her a big hug. She was so happy. At around 8 p.m., the group got to the restaurant, and Nancy was happily surprised to see that none of her parents' friends were meeting them there. The celebration would now just be with family. It wasn't that Nancy didn't like her parents' friends, though. Some of them had been around for so long that they actually felt like her own family. Like her dad's work friend, Nick Biro, and his wife Joan, who she had totally expected to be there. But then there was this guy, Victor, who was one of her father's closest friends, but he was also rumored to be in the mob. Nancy didn't mind Victor, but Richard could not stand him. So his absence from the party was a relief. As the food started to arrive to their table, Nancy suddenly didn't feel well. Her pregnancy was giving her really bad nausea, and the smell of pasta and steak just set it off. But she didn't want to ruin the night for everyone, so she tried to hide the fact that she really just wanted to go throw up. However, she could see her mom looking over at her with a raised eyebrow from across the table, and Nancy forced a smile back. She knew she was not convincing her mother that she was doing okay, but her mother just went back to her lasagna without saying anything, in fear she might embarrass her daughter. After dinner, Nancy and the rest of her family all piled back into Richard's car so he could drive everybody home. He dropped Nancy's sister Jean off first, and when she got out, Jean gave Nancy a big hug and told her she would see her tomorrow at church. Then Richard dropped off Nancy's parents. However, Nancy's mother paused before getting out of the car. She said she noticed at dinner that Nancy was feeling sick and asked if maybe Nancy and Richard wanted to spend the night there, at her house. For a second, Nancy did consider it. I mean, having your parents around if you're feeling sick is kind of like what everybody wants. But Richard was supposed to dog sit for a neighbor, and she wanted to sleep in her own bed, cuddled up with Pepsi, so she ultimately said, no thank you. Her parents then said goodnight, and then they walked into their house. On the drive back home, Richard and Nancy planned out the rest of their evening. Richard would walk the neighbor's dog, and then actually sleep over at the neighbor's house to keep the dog company. But first, Nancy and Richard would take their dog, Pepsi, for a walk together. They pulled up to their townhouse, and Richard walked around the car, opened up Nancy's door, and helped her outside. They smiled at each other, and he asked her how she was feeling, and Nancy said she still felt nauseous, but she was too happy about everything to let it bother her. Richard gave Nancy's shoulder a quick squeeze, and then they walked inside together. At 7 a.m. the next morning, Nancy's mother called her daughter to see if she was feeling any better. But Nancy didn't pick up, so her mom figured she must be sleeping in and hung up without leaving a message. She knew she would just see her daughter later at church anyway. However, when Nancy's mother got to church that day and took her seat in their regular pew, the bench beside her stayed empty for the entire service. Nancy's mom worried the entire time, so as soon as she got back home, she called her daughter again. And when Nancy still didn't answer, Nancy's father said he was going over to the townhouse to make sure everything was okay. Nancy's dad got to the townhouse just a few minutes later. He figured Nancy was just sick and sleeping, so he wasn't actually all that worried. He rang the bell, but nobody answered, so he took out his own key, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The place felt oddly quiet, and no one responded when he called out. Then Nancy's dad saw his daughter's purse lying on the floor, surrounded by cash and credit cards, and so now he was worried. Suddenly, he heard a noise upstairs. It sounded like scratching on a door. So he ran out of the room, took the steps up 2 at a time, and then headed down the second-floor hallway to Nancy's bedroom, where the scratching sound was coming from. There, he opened up the door, and the little dog Pepsi came running out, and the stench of urine immediately hit Nancy's dad. Now he was really starting to panic. He knew his daughter would never lock her precious dog in a room long enough for the dog to have to urinate all over the ground. He turned and ran back downstairs, now screaming his daughter's name, but still he didn't get an answer. He knew there was only one place he hadn't checked yet, the basement. Nancy's father ran to the top of the basement stairs. The basement light was on, but all he could see when he looked downstairs were shadowy shapes below, which he assumed must be their moving boxes. But as he slowly walked down the stairs and the shapes came into view, he gasped. They weren't boxes. They were the bodies of his pregnant daughter and his son-in-law. They were both covered in blood. Nancy was still wearing her clothes from the night before, and her eyes were wide open. For a moment, Nancy's father simply froze, unable to process what he was seeing. Then he leapt down the remaining stairs to his daughter's side and grabbed her hand, but it was freezing cold. He sprinted back up the stairs and he dialed 911. Winnetka Police Sergeant Gene Calvados woke up to the sound of his wife's voice calling him from the other room. He blinked at his clock, which read 6:40 p.m. He'd worked overnight and hadn't gotten to bed until about midday, and now his wife was saying he had yet another phone call from headquarters. All Sergeant Calvados wanted was just to go back to sleep, but he forced himself to get up and go to the phone because this was his job. And as soon as he heard his lieutenant's voice in the phone, Calvados snapped wide awake. The lieutenant said there had been a double homicide, and Calvados needed to get to the scene right now. A few minutes later, Sergeant Calvados parked his car outside of Nancy and Richard's townhouse. Calvados had seen plenty of violent deaths in his life. Before he became a police officer, he had served in Vietnam, and he had watched other young men in his unit grow hardened to bloodshed and violence, but Calvados really never got used to it. In fact, Calvados could see the face of every dead person he'd ever seen as clearly as if they were still right in front of him. And now he braced himself for the faces he was about to see in that basement. Sergeant Calvados stepped out of his car, and he saw several officers speaking to Nancy's father outside the house. Calvados quickly introduced himself and then headed inside, where a forensics team was already combing through the townhouse. One of the forensics officers came over to Calvados. He said the double homicide had taken place in the basement, but before Calvados went downstairs, he wanted to show the detective 3 pieces of evidence they'd found on the first floor. The forensics officer pointed to the ground just a few feet away, and Calvados noticed Nancy's purse lying there with $500 in cash and several credit cards lying next to it. Calvados quickly noticed there was still a TV and a high-end stereo in the room, so it seemed unlikely that what they were dealing with here was a robbery gone bad. Then the forensics officer led Calvados towards a door that opened onto a small back patio. Calvados saw a perfectly cut square piece of glass, which had been removed from the door and placed on the floor inside. And the forensics officer pointed out something interesting. The door was still locked. So whoever cut the glass did not reach through the hole and unlock the door, which would have been easy. Instead, they literally climbed through the small hole in the door, which would have taken far more time and effort. Finally, the forensics officer took Calvados over to a small card table that was next to a moving box. The officer said it looked like someone had rifled through the box and put a single item from it on the table. Calvados leaned in, and a look of surprise came across his face. The item on the table was Nancy and Richard's marriage license. But the forensics officer said he didn't know yet if the person who broke in had put the license there or if maybe it just happened to be there already. Calvados thanked the officer, and then after taking a deep breath, he headed to the basement, hoping things would start to get a bit clearer down there. Calvados walked down the steps slowly, and as the scene came into view, he couldn't help but wince. Richard had been handcuffed and shot in the back of the head. it looked like he had probably died instantly. Nancy, though, was not handcuffed, and her death had clearly been slow. She was shot twice in her side and in her abdomen, and there was blood smeared all around her body, like she had crawled or rolled in the blood after being wounded, and her eyes were still open, frozen in her final moment. Calvados also saw an axe on the floor between Richard and Nancy, and he wondered how that figured into the crime if the killer had a gun. Had the couple tried to fight back with it? He didn't know. Then something else caught Sergeant Calvados' attention. On a moving box between the bodies, a small heart and the letter U were scrawled in blood. Calvados crouched down and saw blood on one of Nancy's fingertips, so he wondered if she had left this message or if the killer had staged it to look that way. Regardless of the answer, Calvados realized whoever killed Nancy and Richard had not acted in the heat of the moment. The handcuffs and the execution-style shooting of Richard proved that. And that execution-style shooting made Calvados wonder if the murders had been carried out by a professional hitman. The cut glass in the patio door could also support that theory because it suggested a very high level of planning. But Calvados stood there and just shook his head, like he was arguing with himself. Removing the glass in the door seemed like something a professional would do, but then why would the professional killer squeeze through the small hole in the door instead of just reaching in and unlocking the door? Also, Richard's murder seemed like a cold-blooded, very efficient assassination, whereas Nancy's murder seemed sloppy. She clearly lived long enough to roll or crawl through the blood on the floor, and she might have lived long enough to even write that message on the moving box. So in a way, Calvados felt like he was almost looking at two different crime scenes at once, one crime scene for Richard and one crime scene for Nancy. Calvados suddenly felt a tap on his shoulder. It was one of the officers who'd been talking to Nancy's dad. The officer told Calvados he had very important information. Nancy had been pregnant. Calvados' heart sank. He knew the look on Nancy's face would stay with him for a very long time. Later that day, as officers met with Nancy and Richard's neighbors, the chief of police decided to form a task force to investigate the double murder. He said he would ask for help from detectives from surrounding suburbs, but he wanted Sergeant Calvados to lead the team. Calvados knew this was going to be the biggest challenge of his career. A double homicide of a young couple that was potentially carried out by a professional hitman was a whole different level of crime than he'd ever seen in Winnetka. The next day, Sergeant Calvados knocked on the door of Nancy's parents' house. Nancy's dad opened the door, and Calvados could tell from his puffy eyes that he'd been crying. As gently as he could, Calvados asked the father if he could get Nancy and Richard's wedding albums and address books, or anything that could help him identify all of their friends and acquaintances. Nancy's father just nodded, looking shell-shocked, and invited the sergeant to come inside while he looked. Calvados stepped inside and then sat down on the couch, and Nancy's mother came in. She also had a vacant stare on her face, almost like she literally couldn't process what had happened. Still, almost on autopilot, she politely offered him some coffee, which Calvados said no thank you to. Then, Calvados told her that he was the one leading this investigation, and he really needed her to think as hard as she could about all the people in her daughter's life. Did she know anyone who might want to hurt Nancy or Richard? But Nancy's mother shook her head and said no. And as Nancy's father came in with the things the sergeant had asked for, he also said the same thing. Nancy and Richard were wonderful people with a big supportive group of friends. The idea that either of them had enemies seemed kind of ridiculous. On Tuesday, April 10th, so 3 days after the murders, Nancy and Richard's bosses at the coffee company offered a $10,000 reward for information in the case, and also Nancy's parents matched it. And so tips about Nancy and Richard began to pour in. Phones at police headquarters rang constantly, and before long, the task force was totally inundated. And as Sergeant Calvados sifted through all this new information they were getting, a new and much more complicated picture of the murdered couple began to emerge. A few tipsters alerted the sergeant to Richard's gambling debts, and the fact that he very likely owed people money because of his gambling problem. This was a major red flag to Calvados, but the debts themselves actually seemed way too small to be worth killing two people over. However, the tips about Nancy were more promising. Apparently, she had had an affair for more than a year, and her former lover had left town for Georgia just 2 days after the murders. This, combined with the marriage contract left on the table at the crime scene, made Calvados wonder if the killings were retaliation from Nancy's ex-lover for breaking the affair off. Calvados sent detectives down to Georgia to speak with Nancy's former lover, but the man said the affair was far more emotional than physical. Nancy mostly just wanted someone to talk to because Richard was working 2 jobs and she was just kind of lonely. But when Richard got his full-time job at the coffee company, the couple had totally reconciled and they got back to normal. And so this ex-lover said at that point, he also had been ready to move on. And so even though the move to Georgia came so close to the murders, it had actually been planned out for weeks. Calvados wasn't quite prepared to rule this man out quite yet, but he was already finding this case very frustrating. Everything from the conflicting evidence at the crime scene where, one murder is well planned and the other seems sloppy, and, the glass, why did you climb through and not unlock it by reaching through, to the contradictory stories about the victims seemed to pull him in very different directions. Meanwhile, rumors of hitmen and criminal syndicates began flying all over town. There was a bike path that ran behind Nancy and Richard's house, leading basically all the way to Chicago, and residents became convinced that a Chicago mobster must have been the killer, and they must have used that path to travel in and out sight unseen. Calvados did not necessarily buy that, but he got a tip that a close friend of Nancy's father, a man named Victor, supposedly had ties to the mafia. So Calvados began digging. However, he struggled to find anything useful. At least on the surface, Victor looked like an upstanding businessman. So Calvados was not any closer to nailing down a primary suspect. Four days after the murders, a massive crowd of 800 people from the area gathered for Nancy and Richard's funeral. The community really came out in force, to the point where random local groups like the high school's Peace Alliance Club and the track team were waiting in these long lines after the service just to offer their condolences to Nancy and Richard's family. Their deaths really took a toll on this town. Sergeant Calvados and some other detectives also went to the funeral, but mostly just to look for anybody who seemed nervous or excited or maybe overly dramatic. But all they found was a large group of people trying desperately to understand how something this horrible could have happened. After the funeral, Calvados went back to the station. He was on his way to his office when a lieutenant stopped him to tell him that somebody was there to see him. The lieutenant took Calvados to a very nervous-looking couple who said they had a tip about Nancy's sister, Jean. Jean was a lawyer, and she was heavily involved in political issues in Ireland. At that time, Ireland was in the midst of a violent period known as the Troubles. The Troubles were clashes between Protestants and Catholics over control of Northern Ireland, and there were regular shootings, car bombings, murders, and kidnappings. And Jean was not neutral. She provided legal aid to members of the Irish Republican Army, or IRA, which was the Catholic organization blamed for many acts of violence. The couple also told Sergeant Calvados that Jean had received a threat that if she returned to Ireland, she would be injured or maybe even killed. But despite that threat, Jean had gone back to Ireland very recently, and when she had arrived home, she showed up with gifts for Nancy and the baby just 3 days before the murders. The sergeant listened quietly, but inside, he was practically jumping out of his skin. This was the best lead he'd gotten so far. Maybe, he thought, somebody was hired to kill Jean, but killed Nancy and her husband by mistake. Or maybe they killed Nancy on purpose just to hurt Jean. It was not unheard of during the Troubles for innocent family members to be targeted for political revenge. And so, after speaking to this couple, Calvados got on the phone and called Jean into the station. Later that day, Calvados sat down across a table in a small interview room with Jean, and he could tell right away she was completely unlike any suspect he'd ever questioned before. Jean was unusually confident for somebody who was about to be questioned by a homicide detective. She sat up perfectly straight and calmly looked Calvados right in the eyes, without fidgeting or tapping her fingers or shifting around in her seat. Calvados asked Jean some basic questions about her job, and she was quite helpful. But then, the sergeant mentioned the threat that had been made on her life because of her work in Ireland, and also this theory that maybe a hired killer took out Nancy either by mistake or for revenge. At this point, Jean's demeanor totally changed. She went from cool and collected to sharp and visibly angry. She said it was ridiculous to imagine a gunman could confuse Nancy for her. They looked nothing alike. And the idea that someone would kill Nancy to get back at Jean was even more outrageous. Jean insisted that her job in Ireland was mostly human rights work, and not worth killing her over, let alone her sister. Jean leaned forward and looked Calvados dead in the eyes and told him he was really stretching with that theory. Calvados was genuinely surprised. This was not what he was expecting, and he wasn't sure if Jean's reaction was fueled by righteous indignation at questions she truly considered unfair, or anxiety and guilt at the idea that she might have played a role in putting her sister at risk. But the sergeant pressed on, and he asked Jean for the names of every person she had visited the last time she was in Ireland, along with all of her work associates there. Jean turned red and yelled at the sergeant that none of this had anything to do with her sister's murder. She said Calvados was not getting anything from her, and then she stood up and stormed out of the interview room. Sergeant Calvados just sat there, both really surprised and really mad. This death threat on Jean was the first real lead they had, and he couldn't fully investigate it without the names from Jean. He had expected her to be grateful and to immediately offer up anything she knew to try to figure out who killed her sister. And so he just couldn't believe Jean was unwilling to help him, unless, of course, she was involved. Without any information from Jean about the death threat, Calvados was left chasing other possibilities that frankly just seemed increasingly unlikely. Both Richard and Nancy had worked for a coffee company that imported their beans from Colombia, which Calvados and basically everybody knew was a major importer of cocaine. He knew that drug cartels sometimes hid cocaine in coffee shipments. In fact, just 3 months before the murders, federal agents had seized 5 kilograms of cocaine in a coffee shipment from a different coffee company. So Calvados started poking around into the coffee company, looking for any ties to cartels. But the owners of the company seemed mostly puzzled by this, and they gave Calvados permission to inspect their next shipment. Like, they didn't care at all. Look at whatever you want. And so Calvados did that, flagging the ship that had their coffee on it to U.S. Customs officers, who then met the vessel when it came into port. A giant crane lifted the container with their coffee out of the ship and onto the dock, and then Customs officer cracked it open. Then they began slicing through random bags of beans to see if their drug-sniffing German shepherds could pick up a scent. But, like Calvados had feared, they found nothing. The police began to feel like they were just grasping at straws, and so they decided they should just go back to the beginning and kind of start over. So they re-interviewed all the neighbors, and they got one tantalizing tip about a mysterious man walking around the neighborhood the night of the murders, but after looking into it, they discovered it was actually just a bored teenager who lived nearby. After that, they looked into whether Richard and Nancy had maybe taken a loan from mobsters to lease their new place, but when they looked at the couple's tax records, they saw they could easily afford the rent. And so, once again, one after another, all the tips and leads they were finding just went nowhere. Calvados still had suspicions that Jean's ties to the IRA got her sister killed, but without Jean's cooperation, he struggled to make any headway on that lead. So, by the end of May, Sergeant Calvados was basically out of ideas as his big case rapidly went cold. Finally, on May 30th, so about a month after the murders, the police chief pulled Calvados into his office. From the look on Chief's face, Calvados knew the news was not good, but he could not have guessed what was coming next. The chief told him they were going to dismantle the task force. They had spent a whopping $1 million on this investigation so far and still had not come up with a serious single suspect. Calvados was shocked. This felt way too early to basically give up. But the chief wasn't done. In addition to dismantling the task force, he wanted Calvados back on the beat while another investigator stepped in and took a look at this case. The chief followed up and told Calvados that he was not taking him off the case completely, he just wanted a set of fresh eyes on it. But as Calvados nodded and turned to walk out of the office, it definitely felt like he had failed and he was being removed. Sergeant Calvados walked slowly towards his team to break the bad news, at the same time feeling totally sick and angry at the thought of patrolling the neighborhood again with everything in this case still completely up in the air. But a few days later, sure enough, Calvados was back in his blue uniform, driving a police cruiser around Winnetka. He figured his days as a detective were likely over. 6 months passed with no progress at all in the Langert case. Sergeant Calvados focused on working his beat, but at the same time, he just felt so distracted because all he felt was regret that he had not been able to find the killer. But then, on October 4th, Sergeant Calvados was home sleeping when his wife woke him up telling him that work was calling, just like she had done on the day of the murder. But this time, when he picked the phone up, his lieutenant was yelling excitedly that there had been a break in Nancy and Richard's case, and Calvados had to get down to the station right now. Calvados was so excited, he rushed out of bed, he jumped into his car, and he sped to the station. But when he got there, he found the supposed break was just a kid, and not a very tough-looking kid either. It was a skinny high school senior who had arrived at the station with his girlfriend for moral support, asking about the witness protection program. Calvados had to keep himself from rolling his eyes. He wondered what this kid could possibly know about a brutal double homicide. And at first, when the kid began talking, his story, predictably, sounded unbelievable. The kid said he somehow knew the killer, and the killer had supposedly confessed everything to him in unbelievable detail. But as he began walking Calvados and the other detectives through what he knew, Calvados realized this kid was telling the truth. The teenager knew details of the crime that had never been made public, like how many shots were fired and the fact that the marriage contract was on the table. But beyond individual details, the teenager's story explained all the strange contradictions that Calvados had struggled with since the beginning of the case. Richard was killed quickly and efficiently, but Nancy's murder was messy and slow. The killer had apparently brought a gun along, but someone had grabbed an axe that wasn't entirely clear, and then the killer had used glass-cutting tools to get inside, but then needlessly crawled through the tiny hole in the door instead of just reaching through and unlocking it. And so all these things definitely lined up with what Calvados had suspected. Calvados had never been able to figure out if the killer was a professional hitman or a sloppy amateur, but now, as the sergeant listened to this kid talk, it seemed like the killer might have been a little bit of both. After speaking to this kid and looking at all the evidence in the case and looking at all their interviews, here is a reconstruction of what police think happened on the night of Saturday, April 7th, 1990, when Nancy and Richard were murdered inside of their home. The killer arrived at Nancy and Richard's townhouse while the couple was out to dinner. The killer had been preparing for this moment for months. They approached the patio door from the path that ran behind the house. They didn't even bother trying the doorknob. Instead, they pulled out a glass cutter to remove a section of the sliding patio doors. And then once the cuts were made, they stuck some very sticky tape to the front of the glass piece and then pulled it out silently, just like they had been practicing. Then, once it was out, instead of reaching through and opening the door, the killer crawled into the house through the hole and then waited. But they had no idea how long it would be before Nancy and Richard came home, and as the minutes turned to hours, the killer began to get restless. And so they just started wandering around the house sort of aimlessly, rifling through random boxes that were sitting around. And it was there that the killer found Nancy and Richard's marriage contract. They began to read it, but it was mostly legal jargon, so they just placed it on the card table near the box they dug it out of. But the longer the killer waited for Nancy and Richard to come home, the more impatient they got, and the more nervous. And so they ultimately just turned on a light and then sat on a chair in the shadows with their gun on their lap. They had a hood pulled down low, but they thought the light shining from behind them would help hide their face even more. Then finally, sometime after 11 p.m., the killer heard voices and then the key in the door. Nancy and Richard walked inside, but they were so caught up in their conversation, they didn't even notice the killer sitting there. But then the killer spoke and told them to be quiet and closed the door behind them. The killer could instantly see how startled Nancy and Richard were. The killer then raised their gun, and Nancy and Richard's surprise quickly turned to fear. The killer loved it. The killer demanded Nancy hand over her purse. She said she didn't have any money, but the killer demanded the purse again, and so Nancy threw it to the killer. And everything inside of it fell out onto the floor, including the stack of cash totaling $500. Nancy started stammering that she'd forgotten about the money, and Richard urged the killer to just please take the cash and go. She wasn't trying to lie to you. But the killer, who acted totally offended at the idea that they were hiding things from him, was not actually here for their money. They didn't care. The killer, still aiming their gun at Nancy and Richard, reached into their pocket to pull out handcuffs. But as they fished around in their pocket, they began to curse. In their excitement about this night, they'd only brought one pair of handcuffs, not the two they actually needed. But Richard was clearly the bigger threat. He was a tall, athletic guy, so the killer gave the cuffs to Nancy and told her to handcuff her husband. As Nancy handcuffed Richard's hands behind his back, she began to plead with the killer. "Please don't hurt us. I'm pregnant." Something about Nancy's plea hit the killer hard, and they could feel their hands begin to shake. Suddenly there was a noise upstairs, and the killer accidentally pulled the trigger, shooting a bullet into the baseboards. But the killer quickly realized that the noise was just the dog, closed in the upstairs bedroom, barking at something. Still, the killer felt like their plan was now quickly falling apart. Things were already going so wrong. The killer started to lose their nerve, and they thought about sparing Nancy and Richard. So the killer told the couple to go to the basement, and then once they were down there, the killer would lock the door and just leave. And so the killer directed Nancy and Richard to the basement stairs at gunpoint, and no one said a word. But as Nancy and Richard descended the stairs and then reached the bottom of the stairs, Nancy suddenly turned around and looked at the killer. and the killer knew from her surprised look on her face that she had seen the killer's face. The light was better down there, and the hood did not disguise the killer enough. The killer knew Nancy would be able to identify them. And so now the killer had a choice to make: let them live and face the consequences, or follow through with the plan. But before the killer could decide, Richard made a desperate move. With all his strength, he snapped the cheap handcuffs, jumped at the killer, and smashed his own head against the killer's head. Almost instinctively, the killer just fired the gun, and it hit Richard right in the back of his head. Richard crumpled to the floor. Nancy rushed to his side, screaming, then looked back at the killer, whose gun was still raised. Nancy shouted, "Not again, no!" and covered her face as the killer took a shot at her. The killer turned and ran up the stairs, but as they got to the top, they looked back. Nancy was still alive and moving. The bullet had only hit her in the elbow. The killer knew at this point they had already come this far, they had to go back. So the killer raised their gun again and pulled the trigger one more time. The bullet hit Nancy and lodged in her pregnant stomach. She collapsed to the floor, and the killer turned and ran out of the basement. But after the killer left, Nancy was still alive. Barely. She tried to climb up the stairs, but it was a struggle. The coat she was wearing was quickly filling with blood, weighing her down. And so with an enormous effort, she managed to pull off her jacket, but as she looked up the stairs, she knew it was just too much. She would never get up there. So Nancy turned and dragged herself over to the basement shelves and grabbed the nearest thing she could reach, the axe. And then with the axe, she banged on the shelf, hoping that the noise would get somebody's attention, but nobody came to the rescue. And so with her last bit of strength, Nancy dropped the axe, dipped her finger in her own blood, dragged herself over to a moving box on the floor, and drew a heart and the letter U. She looked at Richard, hoping maybe there was a small chance he would live and see her final message: "I love you." And then Nancy took her final breath. When the police began investigating this case, they knew that some of the evidence suggested the killer was an amateur, but most of their leads pointed to a professional hitman, which is why Calvados and his team had been so interested in the mob and in drugs and the IRA. It was a mistake that allowed one person to escape any attention at all, because the killer was right there, hanging around the investigation in plain sight the entire time. He was one of the members of the High School Peace Alliance Club who came to the funeral. He was on the track team too, so he ran past the Langert's house almost every single day. The police had even questioned him, because he was also the teenage boy who had been seen in the neighborhood on the night of the murders, but had quickly been written off. But it turned out that kid, the 16-year-old named David Biro, was the killer. And he also happened to be the son of Nancy's family friends, Nick and Joan Biro, who Nancy had thought might be at her father's birthday party on the night that she was killed. It would turn out 16-year-old David had serious psychological issues, and he had become obsessed with becoming a hitman after seeing the 1980s movie, Bestseller, about a hitman who wanted to turn his story into a book. The idea of killing people excited David, and he had actually already tried to do it at least once before. Prior to the murders, David's parents had him committed to a psychiatric hospital after he tried to poison his own family. But after only 2 months, his parents had let him come home against the recommendation of his doctors. And once he was home, teenager David Biro chose to live out his hitman fantasy by killing Nancy and Richard. And his reason for targeting Nancy and Richard had nothing to do with their connections to his family. Instead, he chose them as his murder victims because their townhouse was conveniently located, and he also found them, quote, annoying. David might have gotten away with these murders, but as the months went by and the police never came for him, he got cocky, and he began to brag to a friend about what he had done. He even showed his friend the glass that he'd practiced his glass cutting on, and he also showed him the murder weapon. And David's friend pretty much immediately turned him in, because he was very worried David would kill again. And so, on October 5th, 1990, almost 6 months to the day after Nancy and Richard were gunned down, David was arrested. It was the day before Nancy's baby would have been due. David was sentenced to life in prison for killing Nancy, Richard, and their unborn child. Nancy's parents would move back into Nancy and Richard's townhouse shortly after the murders as a way to feel closer to Nancy and Richard.
In the spring of 2013, a young woman named Melissa finally moved out of her mother's house and got her own place across town. For the first few months she was living there, she never noticed anything strange. But about 3 months into living there, things started to get a little bit weird. It started with a whole bunch of hang-up calls where someone from different numbers would call, she'd answer, and she could hear them breathing, but they weren't saying anything. And then she started getting these huge bouquets of flowers delivered to her front step, but they were delivered from anonymous. Then, after that, she started noticing things in her kitchen and her living room were going missing. Things like plates, cups, drink coasters, salt shakers, forks and knives, little things, but since she lived alone and she was the only one moving these things, they really stood out. Melissa had this habit that every time she went to bed, she would unplug her TV. She had this irrational fear if she didn't do that it would spark a fire and her house would burn down in the middle of the night. So she was pretty obsessive compulsive about always making sure the TV was unplugged before she went upstairs to bed. And so one night, around the same time she's getting these hang-up calls and there's flowers being sent to her door and things are going missing, she unplugs her TV and she goes up to bed. The next morning she gets up and comes downstairs and the TV's plugged in again. She convinces herself that, well, she must have forgot to unplug the TV. As rare of an event as that is, it has to be what happened. And so that night, she unplugs the TV and remembers looking directly at the plug, confirming that, yes, I've unplugged the TV. And then she puts it down and looks again at the outlet. It's not plugged in. It's definitely not plugged in. And then she goes upstairs to bed. The next morning when she walks downstairs, she had the sense of dread that when she turned the corner, because her TV was right at the bottom of the stairs, that when she turned the corner, it would be plugged in again and her worst nightmare would come true, that something is happening on my first floor when I'm asleep at night. And as she comes down the stairs and turns the corner, what does she see? The TV is plugged in again. She's horrified but has no idea what to do. It's not some malicious act. And she's telling herself, well, maybe I forgot again. But then she's like, no, I remember last night staring at the plug. I definitely unplugged it. And so she flies around her first floor to make sure, one, everything is locked, but two, no one else is in here. And when she's satisfied that, yup, it's empty down here, and two, everything is locked, she sits there thinking, well, now what do I do? Do I call the police and say, someone's plugging in my TV? You know, she can't do anything. And it was at this point that Melissa developed a very real fear of her first floor. And she began going to bed so early at night because she could not be on that floor when it started to get dark. And so imagine living alone, being afraid of going down to your first floor, how scary it would be at night when you're laying in bed, your door's shut, and any noise you hear in the house, you're going to attribute to your first floor. And so Melissa was living this absolutely wretched life where she's scared of everything outside of her bedroom. And so with that as context, Melissa goes to bed one night super early, probably like 3 o'clock. The sun's not even down yet, but she's upstairs. But eventually it does get dark outside and she still has not fallen asleep. And so she sits up in bed and she turns on the TV. And right away, the channels on the screen start to change. And she's thinking, oh, I must be laying on the remote. But then she remembers the remote's in my hand. And so she's looking at the remote and then she's looking at the TV. She's not touching her remote. And the channels are still cycling. Now, Melissa had what's called a skybox, which means her downstairs TV was connected to her upstairs TV and vice versa. If one was changing the channel, in real time, the other changed the channel. And so as she's looking at her remote and not touching it, and looking at the screen as the channels are changing, it dawns on her that someone downstairs is changing the channels. And so frozen in fear, all she can think to do is turn off her TV because that's the one function that does not have any impact on the other TV. So she turns the TV off. And so in total darkness, in a house she's already terrified of, she is straining her ears to try to hear some sign that this is either something, someone's down there flipping through channels, or this is nothing, and I just happened to turn the TV on when the skybox was malfunctioning. And as she's sitting there, all she can hear is her own breathing, and she can feel the pounding of her heart in her chest. But she doesn't hear any sounds in her house. She doesn't hear the TV on. She doesn't hear footsteps, doors opening, none of that. It's silence in the house. So after what probably felt like an eternity, she just grabbed the pillow and clutched it in front of her and put her head into the pillow and just laid like that until she eventually fell asleep. The next morning when she gets up, the sun is out and it's this huge relief because suddenly, with the sunlight pouring in the windows, it was like the house wasn't scary anymore. And she's telling herself, you know what, that had to have been just some anomaly with the skybox. I bet I go downstairs and the TV's unplugged. And so she goes downstairs and the TV is unplugged. And so that for her kind of confirms that, okay, the paranoia is getting to me. I'm losing my mind a little bit. I gotta tell someone what's going on. And so as it happens, that day she was going to a family birthday party. And so when she gets there, she pulls her older brother aside and says, here's the strange things that are happening in my house with the skybox and all this. And at first, He looked at her like, really? This is what's going on? You're seeing ghosts in your house? But when she really focused on these specific things that were happening, like the plug going back into the wall 2 separate times, and then the skybox thing. So the TV is kind of wrapped up in the weirdness that's been happening in her house and the missing items in her house. And so for the brother, it all kind of added up to, okay, this does seem a little bit weird. And he offered to live with her for a few days and just see it for himself. And as they're talking, their younger brother happens to walk by, overhears the conversation, and says, oh, I'll stay there too. For 4 days, the 2 brothers lived on the first floor of Melissa's house, and they don't see anything, they don't hear anything, it's completely ordinary. And Melissa at first was reassured, but then started to think, does that mean whoever's been doing this stuff is watching my house really closely and knows that I have, protection at my house right now and they're staying away? Does that mean I'm being watched really closely? And so finally, when her brothers are getting ready to leave after the 4th day, she was practically begging them to stay. She couldn't stand the idea of staying in this house. Her brothers reassured her that she had nothing to worry about, but if she experienced anything weird, anytime, any day, just call or text and they would be there in a heartbeat. Although she did not feel reassured, it was starting to get late, at least by her standards. It was like 3 o'clock, so the sun's getting close to going down, so she needs to go upstairs. So she goes back in her house and does like 20 trips around her house to confirm everything is shut, everything is locked, no one's in the house, everything is safe, and then she goes upstairs to bed. But like most nights, she was so scared of everything outside of her bedroom door that she couldn't sleep. And as she's laying there in utter silence in her room, she hears the unmistakable sound of her back door opening. And she hears footsteps walking through her first floor, and then she hears the TV turn on, and her brothers have been watching her TV last, and they had the volume set really, really high. So as soon as the TV went on, it blared all through the house. And immediately the TV turned back off, because whoever turned it on knew that that was going to wake up whoever was in the house. Melissa doesn't know what to do. Before, whatever the heck was happening in her house was a little bit subtle. It was like she had to think about what she was hearing to confirm it was actually happening. Now, this person is just strolling into her house in the middle of the night and flipping on the TV and blaring it through the house. And so she immediately is like, oh my God, what do I do? And she picks up her phone and she calls her brother. Then he picks up right away and she goes, someone is in the house right now. The brother's like, I will be there in 10 minutes. Do not leave your bedroom. Don't do anything. Stay on the phone with me. So Melissa's shaking out of fear, and she gets up as slowly as she can, and she walks over to the window to get as far away from the door, which was locked, as she possibly could. And she's glancing out the window, waiting to see her brother pull up as she listens for any sign that this person downstairs has begun walking upstairs. Finally, Melissa sees out of the corner of her eye her brother's car pulls up across the street, and he, along with her younger brother, hop out. They run across the street towards her house. They hop over the fence, and they run down the alley between her house and her neighbors, and they go towards the back out of sight. She's still on the phone with him, and she's saying, do you see him? Do you see him? Do you see him? Do you see him? And he says, hold on. He goes to the back of the house where he knows you can look in and basically see the whole first floor. And as soon as he gets to that spot where she's expecting him to give her a report, and he pauses, there's silence on the phone, and she goes, what do you see? And he says, okay, yep, there is someone in your living room right now. I'm gonna hang up and call the police, and I'm gonna call you right back. Now, Melissa knew what she heard was very real to her, but to have it confirmed by her brother right now took this to a whole nother level of fear. Now she's legitimately fearing for her life. There is a person, an intruder in my house right now, confirmed. They are right downstairs, and they've been coming into my house probably for weeks. And so her brother hangs up the phone and begins calling the police. Meanwhile, Melissa is just standing in this room, horrified, as she listens to a stranger walk around the first floor of her house. But because she was hearing the footsteps clearly downstairs, she decided she would just walk over to her door and look through the keyhole, which was oversized on her door. And if you looked through it and over to the left, you'd actually look downstairs to the first floor. You'd only see a sliver of the first floor. And so very carefully, she walks her way over to the door. And as she kneels down to look through the keyhole, her phone rings. It was in her pocket, and it wasn't on silent. It was on loud, and it was her brother calling back. And she kind of fumbles for her phone. She drops it on the ground. It's still ringing. And she finally silences it. And then reflexively, she pokes her head back and looks through the keyhole. And standing at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at her, is a man with a hat pulled over his eyes who's clearly heard the sound. And he begins walking up the stairs. She's falling over backwards, screaming at the top of her lungs to get her brothers inside. She hears them come charging inside. She hears this epic struggle on the stairs, and she hears this person who's in her house, because it was a voice she didn't recognize, screaming, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." And then it's quiet. And so she opens that door because she wants to help if she can. And she looks and she sees her brothers have this man pinned on the stairs. He's not moving. And she sees her younger brother is holding something. And he holds it up to her and he just shakes his head, and it's a frickin' knife. And then she puts it together that the stranger in her house was carrying this knife. And before she can even take that information in, the older brother takes the hat off of this guy, and it's their mother's ex-boyfriend from 10 years ago. The same one they all believed had an inappropriate attraction to Melissa. Police show up and take him away, and he quickly admitted to sneaking into her house for months. They don't know how he got in, and he would never tell them, but he admitted that, yep, I was breaking in almost every single night. But he never gave a good reason why. He just started doing it. Police cited mental illness as the likely culprit for why he was doing it, and the family believed this could be something more sinister, but either way, he was given 3 years in jail, and the family, once again, cut all ties with him. Our next story is called The Shaman. On April 27, 1997, a farmer in Indonesia was walking his livestock through a thick sugarcane field near his house when he tripped on something. After he regained his balance and looked down, he noticed a strange mound of dirt that seemed totally out of place. He wanted to dig it up just out of curiosity, but he wasn't on his property, so instead he walked back to the village and he told the village leader about this strange pile of dirt and suggested he see what's under it. So the village leader and some other men headed back out to the field. They find this dirt pile, and the first thing they do is they poke it with a stick. The stick went right into the pile. It was a soft pile of dirt, and when they pulled it out, this horrible stench filled the air that was coming out of this mound. Worried about what they might find underneath this pile, the men decide to leave it alone and go back to the village and tell authorities about it, and the authorities promptly tell them to go back out there and uncover this thing and tell them what they find. And so the village leader and some more men head back out to the field and they start digging. And pretty quickly, their shovels strike something that's fairly soft inside of this mound. And so after delicately removing some more dirt, they discover a woman's face is looking right back at them. It appeared she had been buried up to her neck, and then someone had just thrown dirt on top of her head. At this point, the authorities did come out, and they were able to identify the body as belonging to a 21-year-old local woman named Dewi. After asking around the village about this girl, the police determined the last time anyone had seen her was 3 days earlier when she had left her house to run an errand. But after that, no one knew what happened to her. Just a few hours after Dewi's discovery, a 15-year-old rickshaw driver came to the police with additional information. He said 3 days earlier, on the evening of April 24th, so the same day that people had seen Dewi last, he said she had come to him to ask for a ride. And when she got into the rickshaw, he asked where she wanted to go, and she said she did not want to tell him specifically where she was going. Instead, she just wanted him to drive in a particular direction, and she would give him more information about how to get where she wanted to go as they got closer. And so this really intrigued the driver. And so after he began going in this direction, he turned to her again and said, can you tell me anything more about where we're going? This is really weird that you're not giving me any more information. And so finally, Dewi relented and she told him she was going to see the shaman. A shaman, in simple terms, is someone who uses magic to cure the sick. The driver did think it was odd that this girl was going to see the shaman in the middle of the night and she was being so secretive about it, but after he dropped her off, he hadn't given it much thought until he found out she had died. The police approached the shaman, who was 45-year-old Ahmad Siraji, and they asked him if he had been with Dewi on the night of April 24th. Initially, Siraji said no, he had not been with her and he had no idea what happened to her. But after police searched his house and found Dewi's belongings inside, Siraji said, okay, I've been lying and I have a confession to make. And he would very nonchalantly tell police that not only had he killed Dewi, he had also killed dozens of other women the same way and buried them in the sugarcane field. And so the police went out to the field and started looking around, and they found all these mounds of dirt all over the place, and under them were women buried up to their neck. After the excavation was all done, the police believed they found the bodies of 42 different women, but truthfully, that was just a guess. They believed there could be more. During his trial, Siraji explained in detail why he did the things he did. He said back in 1986, so 11 years earlier, he had this vivid dream where his deceased father came to him and instructed him to drink the saliva of 70 women, and if he did that, he would become immortal. When Siraji woke up, he didn't chalk up this experience as just a strange dream. He believed he had just had a real interaction with the spirit of his dead father, and so he decided he would do as he was told. But his father didn't explain to him how he was going to extract the saliva from these 70 women. And so after thinking about it for a couple of days, Siraji decided the most efficient way to do it would be to just kill the women and then forcibly take their saliva. To find his victims, Siraji began telling people in his village that he had supernatural powers, that he was able to grant women specifically everlasting beauty and riches. And many people believed it. And so as this rumor spread not only around his village, but to surrounding areas, lots of women heard about it and came to him and requested his services. He would tell them to come back later that night when it was totally dark and to not tell anyone where they were going. Once they arrived, they would come inside of Siraji's house and they would pay him a fee that was roughly equivalent to $300. And then he would tell them he needed to perform a ritual to give them their beauty and their riches. And so they would leave his house, they would cut through a cemetery, and they would enter into that sugarcane field, and they would walk for a while until Siraji stopped them. And he would hand the woman a shovel, and he would tell her to dig a hole in the ground. And he would assure her this is part of the ritual. And so he would stand there as she dug the hole until it was about waist deep. And then he would tell her to get in the hole and put her hands by her side. If she was at all nervous, he would just reassure her again that this is all part of the ritual, that lots of people have done this before, that it's totally safe. And so she'd get in the hole, she'd put her hands by her side, Siraji would take the shovel and he would fill the hole back in until she was completely immobilized. And then at this point, Siraji would pull out a cable, he would wrap it around their neck, and he would strangle them to death. And then once they were dead, he would pull their body out of the hole, and then he would forcibly extract their saliva. And then after that, he would take the shovel again and dig the hole a little bit deeper, and then he would put the body back inside the hole, making sure their head was still sticking out of the ground. And he would orient them so their face was looking towards his house, because he believed having these women constantly looking at him at all hours of the day gave him more power. He said as for Dewi, when she first came to his house and she had paid that fee, she was worried about leaving and going and doing this ritual. It scared her. And so Siraji told her to wait, and he went into the other room where his wife was, and he told her that, hey, I'm gonna go kill this girl and I need your help. I need you to calm her down. And his wife, who had no idea her husband was a mass murderer, just immediately went along with it. She came back into the room and she assured Dewi that everything was totally fine. They had done this before. It was all going to be perfectly safe. And she even said she would come with them to do this ritual. And so at this, Dewi was much more calm and she agreed to go. And so the trio left the house. They went through the cemetery out to the field, and then only 2 people came back. Siraji was executed in 2008 by firing squad, and his wife was sentenced to life in prison. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Raven-Haired Woman. In 1889, when Karl Tanzler was just 12 years old and living with his family in Dresden, Germany, he had a very strange dream. In this dream, he found himself in this black void where everywhere he looked, it was just nothingness. And then, behind him, he heard footsteps. And so he whips himself around, and he looks, and there's this woman dressed in this big, puffy, elegant white dress walking towards him out of the darkness. And when she walks right up in front of him, she comes to a stop. And she introduces herself as Anna Constantia von Brockdorf, who was a real person in the early 1700s. She was a noblewoman in Germany. And she would tell Karl that she is actually a distant relative of his, and that she was here to pass on a very important message. Karl was rooted to the spot. He didn't know if he should be afraid of what she was going to say, or excited or nervous, but before he could decide, Anna had already turned and was pointing in the direction she had appeared out of. And so Karl turns and looks in the direction she was pointing, and out of this blackness, out of this void, came this woman's face. It was a face detached from a body. It almost looked like a floating picture of a woman's face. And as this face floated closer and closer to them, Karl was immediately struck by just how beautiful this woman was. Her hair was jet black like a raven's feathers, and her skin was white like porcelain. But there was something off about this woman, this floating face. she looked sad and kind of frail. And so as Carl found himself staring at this face, which was now right next to them, Anna spoke to him again, and she would tell Carl that this woman, the floating face, she's going to appear in your life later on, and it is your mission given by God to save her. She's going to be very ill, very sick, and you need to find a way to keep her alive. Then Carl, in real life, woke up. And immediately he was struck by just how visceral that dream had been. It really felt like that had just happened to him. But after a few moments, it seemed like, okay, that was just a dream. But unlike other visceral dreams he had had in the past, this one did not gradually fade from his memory. Instead, over the course of that day, the memory specifically of the raven-haired woman's face really seemed to become more clear and more concrete in his mind, to the point where at the end of that day, he could easily remember exactly what she looked like. Over the following days and months and years, Carl periodically would have this same dream, this same vision of his distant relative Anna, who would come out of the void, and she would remind him to be on the lookout for this raven-haired woman when God sent her to him. But despite these constant reminders in his dreams, and Carl being ever vigilant to look for this raven-haired woman in real life, he never actually found her. He never met this woman he was supposed to save. Fast forward to 1926, Carl was 39 years old. By this point, he had gotten married, not to the raven-haired woman, but instead to a local woman in Dresden. And the pair had had 2 daughters together, and they lived a simple life. And, by and large, Carl seemed rather content and happy with his life. However, secretly, he was a little disappointed that these dreams, these visions that he was having of Anna and the raven-haired woman, that they had not come true, that it really had just been a dream. That year, due to an economic downturn in Germany, Carl and his family left Germany and emigrated to the United States, where they believed there would be better opportunities for them. And when they arrived in the United States, they settled in Central Florida, but within a year, Carl and his wife had a severe falling out and they split up, and so Carl would leave the family home in Central Florida, and he would resettle several hundred miles south in Southern Florida in a town called Key West. And it would be in Key West that Carl would get a job as an X-ray technician at a local hospital, and it would also be in Key West that Carl's life would change forever. Less than a year after settling in Key West, Carl was at the hospital going about his day when an older woman walked into the office, and she said to Carl that she was there to get her daughter, her 21-year-old daughter, an X-ray of her chest because her daughter apparently couldn't stop coughing and they were concerned about it. And so Carl began doing the paperwork with the mother when suddenly the daughter came into the office. And as soon as Carl saw her, he knew immediately that she was the raven-haired woman from his dreams. She walked in and she sat down in a chair, and Carl just stopped what he was doing and stared at the daughter. And then he kind of broke out of it and turned his attention back to the mother, and he said to her, "Ma'am, don't worry. I will do everything in my power to save your daughter's life." Now, the mother didn't know what was wrong with her daughter, and so this was both really helpful that this man she was talking to was so willing to help, and also kind of ominous that he was already insinuating that she could be dying. But either way, the mother said, "Thank you very much. We really appreciate that." And so Carl and the mother, they finished their paperwork, and then Carl quickly left from behind his desk and hustled over to the daughter, and he introduced himself and he reiterated that she was in good hands. And the daughter was a little bit weirded out by this, but she was polite and said thank you, and she said her name was Elena. And so Carl would take Elena and bring her back and give her the X-ray, and unfortunately he would discover through this X-ray that she had tuberculosis. Today, that disease is easily curable, but at the time, that was a death sentence. When Carl saw this, though, in a weird way, it almost made him happy, because this was another indication that, this really was the raven-haired woman from his dreams. Not only did she look the part, but she also had arrived in desperate need of help. And so now Carl needed to find a way to save her. Even though he was just an X-ray technician, he was not a doctor, and so he had no clue how to begin to treat tuberculosis. But that didn't stop Carl. Over the next year, Carl would be in touch with Elena and her family on a near daily basis, updating them on all of the new techniques to fight tuberculosis that he was doing all this research on, and he would tell them about experimental procedures and drugs they could try, even sometimes paying out of pocket for them to go try them. He would also bring Elena into the office as often as he possibly could to x-ray her again and again and again to see if perhaps she was making good progress. But unfortunately, over the course of that year where he was doing everything he could, it just didn't work. The disease ravaged Elena's body, and on October 31st, 1931, so roughly a year after Carl had first met Elena, Elena would unfortunately pass away. Elena's family was devastated by this, but their grief didn't even compare to Carl's grief. It was like Carl had lost his life too. He couldn't believe he had failed his mission and let the raven-haired woman die. When it came time to bury Elena, Carl said, "Let me pay for the most elaborate gravesite we can possibly make. Let me set up a mausoleum for her." A mausoleum is an external building that sits in a cemetery that effectively serves as a kind of shrine to the deceased. And so her family, they understood that Carl had become very, very close with Elena, although they didn't fully understand the relationship, but they did understand she meant a lot to him, and so they agreed to let him do this. After Elena was buried inside of this small temple that Carl had built for her, Carl began spending virtually all of his time kneeling inside of it, crying and begging for Elena's forgiveness. Elena's family was well aware that Carl was doing this, and at first they kind of just let it happen, but after several months they began to tell Carl, you really need to let her go, you need to begin to move on. But Carl refused. In fact, over time, he only became more and more obsessed with Elena. Finally, after 7 years of Carl doing this, Elena's family decided, enough is enough. He really needs to stop making her loss all about him. It's not his loss, it's our loss. We're her family. And so the family decided the only way to kind of get Carl to stop doing what he was doing is to demand he give the key back that gave him access into the small area inside of the mausoleum. So one night, Elena's sister, whose name was Florinda, decided to go over to Carl's house unannounced and confront him and get the key back from him. And so she hopped in her car and she drove over to his property. His house was kind of set back off the road behind some trees, and so you had to drive down this kind of winding driveway to get to it. And so Florinda turned onto his driveway and she began driving. And when his house came into view, the first thing she noticed was a number of the windows on the first floor were all lit up. Clearly, Carl was home, and as she's driving towards the house, she's just looking in these windows, and for a second, she sees Carl, and he's very elegantly dressed in a suit or a tuxedo, and he's ballroom dancing with this woman who's also very elegantly dressed as well. And for a second, Florinda considered turning around and not disturbing him, but then she thought, you know what, this has been going on for so long, I just need to get this over with. And so she drove her car and stopped in front of Carl's house. She hopped out, she walked up onto his porch, and she knocked on his front door. Inside, she could hear music was clearly playing, but just a few seconds after she had knocked, the music was cut off, and then no one came to the door. And so Florinda knows there's people inside this house, and so she knocks again, but again, there's no movement in the house. It's just silent, as if the people inside are pretending not to be there. And so finally, frustrated, Florinda knocks on the door a third time and says, "Carl, I know you're in there. I have to talk to you about my sister. Please come out here." And so finally she heard the shuffling of feet, and then she heard the sound of the door unlocking, and it opened up just a crack. And through this crack, Carl looked through, and he looked out at Florinda very suspiciously, and he said to her, "What do you want?" And Florinda would say, "Look, I'm here to talk to you about my sister. Can I please come inside for a second? Or can you come out here and talk to me?" But Carl pretty much immediately said no, and then he shut the door. However, before he shut the door, Carl had very briefly stepped out of the way, allowing Florinda to see through that gap into the house. So before the door actually shut, she got to see who and what was inside that house. And what she saw was the woman Carl had been dancing with, and the woman was seated in a chair maybe halfway through the house, and she was facing the door, and Florinda knew immediately it was her sister. And so she's standing on the porch having no idea what to make of what she's just discovered. And so feeling kind of overwhelmed, she just kind of staggered off the front porch, she turned around, she ran into her car, and she drove off to tell the police. When the police came back, they knocked on the front door, and they demanded that Carl let them see the woman he was there with. And so at this point, Carl knew the gig was up, and so he opened the door and he allowed them to come inside. And when the police went inside, they saw the woman he was with, and sure enough, it was Elena. However, Elena was deceased and had been for 7 years. After her death, Carl said he was able to talk to her inside of her mausoleum, And so that was why he was going back there every single night, because he and Elena were spending time together. And then at some point in 1933, so 2 years after Elena has been dead and buried, Carl would say she told him while he was visiting her mausoleum that she didn't like being in the mausoleum and that she wanted to come back with him and stay at his house. And so the following day, Carl had shown up with a child's wagon, and he pulled her out of her coffin, pulled her out of the mausoleum, put her corpse in this wagon, and wheeled her back to his house. He had continued to go to the mausoleum every night for the next 5 years just to keep up appearances, but Elena's body never went back inside of it. She would stay at his house, where he painstakingly attempted to restore Elena's very badly decomposed body to its original form. He strung piano wire through her entire body, connecting all of her bones together to keep her skeleton intact. He replaced her eyes with glass eyes, and he began rubbing the special wax all over her skin. He also stuffed her insides full of rags in order to give her a full, natural look, and he constantly sprayed her with perfume to reduce the smell. Once she was, in his eyes, back to normal, he began spending as much time with her as he possibly could. He would change her outfits constantly, he would put on makeup, and he would give her new jewelry, and he would talk to her about the ups and downs of life. He would laugh with her, he would cry with her, he would sleep with her. Carl would admit that ultimately his goal with keeping Elena in his home was to eventually still save her life. He believed if he could somehow get her body up into the stratosphere, that the radiation up there would bring her back to life. And if he could do that, he would be fulfilling his God-given mission to protect her. But Carl never got a chance to launch her into the stratosphere. Instead, he was charged with wantonly and maliciously destroying a grave and removing a body without authorization. However, these charges would be dropped and Carl would be set free. As for Elena, her body was returned to her family and they would bury her in Key West. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please secretly use the Amazon Music follow button's toothbrush to clean a dog's teeth and then just put their brush back. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support